The story of the Braithwaites and the Grays is not just a feud between neighbors. It is a story of rot and ruin, of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions clinging to the last shadows of the Old South. In the truest sense, their hatred is the living embodiment of a world that refused to die, even as the world was changing around it. The very beginning is not gunfire, but silence. Mist hangs low over the Lemoyne Bayou. Cypress trees lean over black water. Beyond the marsh, the quiet streets of Rhodes sit still, almost peaceful, watched over by two great houses on opposite horizons. To the east, Braithwaite Manor, once a palace of slaveholding wealth, now a decaying monument with cracked columns and tired fields. To the west, Caliga Hall, the Gray estate, its tobacco rows stretching out under a sky that has seen too much smoke. These are not simple homesteads. They stand like rival kingdoms, two castles ruling Scarlet Meadows through money, fear, and memory. Generations of Braithwaites and Grays built their fortunes on enslaved labor, on cotton and tobacco and human misery, then watched that world burn in the Civil War. Yet even in the late 1890s, decades after surrender, both families cling to the same philosophy of entitlement, convinced that honor and bloodline still mean power in a nation that insists civilization has moved on. Beneath the polished manners and white columns, the truth is uglier. The Braithwaites run moonshine through the swamps. The Grays turn the law itself into a family business, with Sheriff Lee Gray using his badge to protect their interests and punish their rivals. Old wealth hides new crimes. Courtesy masks cruelty. What appears to be order is held together by intimidation and whispered threats. Their feud is more than a local squabble. It is a generational blood war, born from plantation aristocracy and hardened by defeat. Each side convinced the other stole land, slaves, and status in the chaos after the war. Children inherit grudges they never chose. Lovers become enemies by birth alone. How many lives are spent keeping an old insult alive? By the time the von der Linde gang rides into Rhodes, that hatred has simmered for decades, ready to ignite. Dutch, Arthur, and the others walk into a town balanced on a powder keg, and every job they take for Catherine Braithwaite or the Gray's corrupt sheriff drives another nail into the coffin of both dynasties. From its humble beginnings as simple work for quick cash, their involvement becomes the spark that turns cold resentment into open war. This is a story set at the end of an era, on the edge of the 20th century, when the old ways were dying but refused to fall quietly. Old wealth clashes with new money, honor with hypocrisy, family loyalty with self-preservation, the illusion of civilization with the brutality beneath. What happens when two kingdoms of rot meet a gang of outlaws already chasing their own fading dream of freedom? That is where this tale truly begins. This is not just a tale of two mansions in flames. It is a story of how those flames were built, brick by brick, lie by lie, from the very beginning of Lemoyne's plantation age to the last dying sparks over Rhodes's empty streets. What follows is a full chronological reconstruction of the Braithwaite Gray saga in the truest sense. From its humble beginnings in slaveholding fields and Civil War battle lines, through reconstruction schemes, moonshine routes, tobacco fortunes, and rigged elections, every step will be laid out. First, whispers of rivalry in the parlors of Scarlet Meadows, the quiet corruption of Sheriff Lee Gray, the whispered name of Catherine Braithwaite in the halls of a decaying manor, and finally, the blackened ruins of Braithwaite Manor and the hollowed shell of Rhodes itself. All of it will be woven into one continuous line. This is not merely a recap of missions. It is a lore deep dive, a story assembled from in-game dialogue, discarded letters, burned photographs, side missions, and the environmental scars left on fields and town squares. A drunken remark in the saloon, a grave tucked behind Caliga Hall, a ruined slave pen behind the manor, the way gray tobacco crates sit beside lawman badges in the sheriff's office. Each detail becomes a clue. Together, they reveal how two houses tried to hold on to power long after the world was changing around them. To trace that power, the narrative follows three intertwined threads. First, the internal histories of the Braithwaites and the Grays, Catherine clinging to faded royalty through moonshine and blackmail, Tavish and Lee Gray turning law into a family business, both clans trapped between idealistic memories of honor and the grim reality of outlaw economics. Second, the forbidden romance of Beau Gray and Penelope Braithwaite, two heirs who reject the feud that created them, the living embodiment of a future Lemoyne that their elders fear. And third, the arrival of Dutch's gang, a band of outlaws chasing freedom, who step into this feud as hired help, saboteurs, and ultimately, as the match that ignites the powder keg and destroys them all. The tone will remain measured but cinematic, advancing steadily, scene by scene, as if recounting a Southern Gothic epic, or a Shakespearean tragedy transplanted to muddy roads and rotting verandas. Loyalty and betrayal, dreams and delusions, family and civilization, will echo through every exchange of gunfire and every quiet conversation on a porch. Moments of bitter irony, a sheriff preaching order while smuggling tobacco, an outlaw gang lecturing aristocrats on morality, will sit alongside genuine heartbreak. So, where does this story truly begin? Not with Arthur Morgan riding into Rhodes, not with the first job for the Grays or the Braithwaites, but with the defeat of the Confederacy and two families who refused to surrender their crowns. The next chapter steps back to that moment when the old ways were dying, but these houses chose fire over surrender. Lemoyne after the war was a kingdom without a crown. The Confederacy had fallen, the banners were gone, but in the swamps and fields around Rhodes, the defeated refused to admit the story was over. Before the gang ever rode south, Scarlet Meadows had been built on chains. Families such as the Braithwaites and the Grays were not just wealthy, they were the living embodiment of a slaveholding aristocracy. Men and women who measured power in acres of cotton, in rows of tobacco, in the number of human beings they owned. From its humble beginnings, Rhodes had been their stage, its streets and courthouse merely props for their private rule. Then the Civil War ended, and emancipation shattered the economy that had made them gods. The enslaved walked away, the markets collapsed, and northern capital began creeping in with railroads and new laws. The world was changing, and in Lemoyne that change felt less like progress and more like humiliation. The old ways were dying, but these houses clung to their land, their titles, and their pride with a desperation that bordered on madness. The game never names the first insult, the first shot, the very beginning of the Braithwaite Gray feud. That silence is telling. It suggests a story of grudges so old that memory has turned them into legend. Disputes over riverfront parcels, over whose slaves were poached, over whose candidate controlled the courthouse before the war. In the truest sense, this rivalry is older than Rhodes itself, passed down through generations as inheritance and curse, a blood oath to hate the neighbors across the fields. When the slave economy vanished, that hatred did not. It simply adapted. Catherine Braithwaite's people turned their decaying plantation into a hidden distillery empire, flooding Lemoyne with illegal moonshine while pretending at faded gentility. Over at Caliga Hall, Tavish Gray and his kin leaned into tobacco smuggling and political corruption, stuffing wagons and ballot boxes in equal measure. One family bought sheriffs, the other bought silence. Both dressed their crimes in fine clothes. Sheriff Lee Gray became the perfect symbol of this new order. The law on paper, a Gray in practice. His badge was less a promise of justice than a family crest. Proof that in Rhodes, civilization meant doing as the old names wished. What happens to a region when its aristocrats trade ledgers for ledgers of contraband? When former masters reinvent themselves as organized outlaws with better manners? By the time Arthur Morgan hears the word Rhodes, the feud is no fresh quarrel. It is an old wound, infected and festering beneath polite conversation, ready to burst at the slightest touch. The Braithwaites and the Grays have lost their slaves, lost their unquestioned rule, but not their appetite for domination or their talent for betrayal. All they lack is a spark. And as the von der Linde gang rides toward that quiet little town, carrying its own dreams and delusions, that spark is about to arrive. That spark has a name. Catherine Braithwaite. If the Grays cling to office and uniform, Catherine clings to a throne built on rot. She is the matriarch of Braithwaite Manor in the truest sense, an aging southern aristocrat whose beauty has curdled into bitterness, whose pride has hardened into cruelty. She rules what remains of her family like a vengeful queen presiding over a ruined court, demanding loyalty, punishing betrayal, and pretending the world beyond her gates has not changed at all. Braithwaite Manor itself tells a different story. Once the living embodiment of Lemoyne's slaveholding glory, it now stands as a hollow monument to a dead civilization. Paint peels from the columns, ivy strangles cracked brick, and the grand veranda sags under the weight of decades. The gardens, once manicured for summer balls and political gatherings, lie overgrown and suffocating, paths swallowed by weeds and stagnant ponds buzzing with insects. Behind the main house, the old slave quarters still scar the grounds, weathered wood and collapsing roofs refusing to disappear, a permanent reminder that the old ways were dying long before Catherine would ever admit it. Inside, the illusion of gentility clings on through lace curtains, fading portraits, and china no one can afford to replace. Outside, the truth lurks in the swamps. From its humble beginnings as a plantation empire, the Braithwaite fortune has shrunk to a desperate, illegal lifeline: moonshine. Hidden stills bubble in the bayou, guarded by armed men who carry themselves as planters but work as outlaws. The family leans on old networks of fear, bribery, and quiet loyalty, moving barrels through back roads and back rooms while insisting, to anyone who will listen, that they remain respectable. Catherine's remaining brood reflects this contradiction. There is Penelope, fragile and idealistic, a young woman who reads about freedom and progress and dares to dream of a world beyond Rhodes, even falling for Beau Gray in a forbidden echo of Romeo and Juliet. Around her circle, brutish sons and cousins, half-drunk enforcers who beat information out of tenants, torch rival stills, and serve as Catherine's fists when her words no longer suffice. Watching all of it are the silent servants and laborers, black and poor white, who move through the manor's halls and fields like ghosts, seeing everything, saying nothing, understanding that speaking truth here is a death sentence. For Catherine, the Greys are not simply rivals. They are traitors to a shared class, collaborators with a world that dares to put limits on her will. She despises their badge, their sheriff's office, their pretense of law. How dare they bend to this new order? How dare they survive the same collapse that nearly destroyed her? That hatred is more than personal. It is a philosophy of refusal, a story of a woman at war with time itself. And when Dutch's gang arrives, carrying its own dreams and delusions, Catherine's obsession will turn that private war into open ruin. If Braithwaite Manor is a haunted relic, then Caliga Hall is the illusion of survival. The road bends, the trees thin, and suddenly the world opens into wide tobacco fields, green and orderly under the Lemoyne sun, rows of laborers moving in rhythm while overseers watch from horseback. The house itself rises beyond them, freshly painted, better kept than Catherine's decaying palace, the living embodiment of a family that thinks it has outlasted history. Look closer. The paint is new, but the foundations are old. The Greys present Caliga Hall as a story of continuity, of an aristocratic house that weathered the war and the collapse of slavery with its dignity intact. In the truest sense, that is a fantasy. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. To keep their empire standing, the Greys did what aristocrats across the South did. They wrapped modern crime in old respectability and called it tradition. At the center of that performance stands Sheriff Lee Gray. On the streets of Rhodes, he is all easy charm and measured smiles, tipping his hat, speaking softly, pretending to be a reasonable man in an unreasonable land. But the badge on his chest is not a symbol of neutral law. It is the family crest in metal. He chooses which crimes matter, which disappear, which outlaws are hunted, and which are quietly escorted to the edge of town and told not to trouble Gray business again. Where does government end and clan begin when the sheriff's office is a family possession? The Gray's tobacco is legal on paper, the lifeblood of Rhodes' economy. Yet the real money moves in the shadows. Smuggled shipments that skip federal taxes, bribes to inspectors, intimidation of smaller farmers who dare to compete. It is a cartel wearing a waistcoat, an outlaw enterprise that never has to run because the law itself is on its payroll. From its humble beginnings as a plantation fortune built on human bondage, the Gray operation has simply traded one invisible labor system for another, hiding coercion behind contracts and guns behind badges. Behind Lee stands the older generation, men like Tavish Gray, still dreaming of gray uniforms and lost battles. They drink on the veranda and talk about honor and states' rights, clinging to Confederate nostalgia as if it were a birthright instead of a wound. Their philosophy is simple and poisonous. The past was better, the present is an insult, and anyone who challenges their place in this world is an enemy. Yet even as they toast the Old South, they count profits, negotiate prices, and quietly adjust to railroads and federal agents. Is that loyalty to heritage, or just fear of losing power dressed up as principle? Inside the family, those contradictions fester. Younger Greys chafe under the old men's stories, resenting the way Lee hoards influence and pretends it is duty. Ambition pulls them toward expansion, resentment pulls them toward recklessness, and beneath it all sits the terror that Caliga Hall might one day fall the way Braithwaite Manor is already falling. That is the fracture Dutch will sense. When an idealistic outlaw philosopher meets a proud house with cracks in its walls, the stage is set for betrayal in the streets of Rhodes and a massacre that will shatter the illusion of Gray control forever. That fracture in the house is reflected in the town that serves it. Rhodes stands at the center of this story of decay and denial, a place that pretends to be peaceful even as every brick is mortared with fear. At first glance, it is almost charming. A quiet main street, a whitewashed sheriff's office, a general store humming with trade, and townsfolk who nod politely to strangers as if nothing in the world is wrong. But the politeness is thin. Men lower their voices when a new rider steps off the train. Women glance toward the road to Caliga Hall before finishing a sentence. From its humble beginnings as a trading post, Rhodes has grown into the living embodiment of Southern respectability on the surface and Southern rot beneath it. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, yet this town is determined to pretend that the war, the plantations, and the blood have all been neatly resolved. In the truest sense, Rhodes is a company town, and the company is the Gray family. Lee Gray's badge is not a symbol of law, it is a family crest. His deputies answer to Caliga Hall before they answer to any court. The gunsmith, the general store, even the saloon rely on Gray tobacco money and Gray patronage. Who receives protection? Who gets harassed? Who can sell their goods without trouble? All of it orbits the plantation and its failing tobacco empire. Yet the Grays are not the only power in town. From the marshes and backroads, the Braithwaites press in through smuggling routes, illegal moonshine, and quiet threats. Their product flows into Rhodes through hidden wagons and back doors, turning the saloon into a neutral ground that is never truly neutral. A bottle on the table might be Braithwaite liquor, poured under a Gray deputy's nose, and everyone at the bar knows it. That is the invisible front line, not marked by fences or flags, but by which crate goes where, and whose name is spoken in a whisper. Everyday life becomes a performance. A Gray rides past, and conversations die mid-sentence. A Braithwaite hand lingers too long in town, and someone mutters that he should not be there after dark. Shopkeepers ask careful questions, not out of curiosity, but to gauge allegiance. Who is buying tobacco? Who is buying moonshine? Who might be foolish enough to buy both? There is tension in every glance, every deal, every Sunday stroll down the main street. The town lives suspended between freedom and civilization, between memory and reality, waiting for something terrible to happen and praying that it never does. Into that fragile balance rides the von der Linde gang, a band of idealistic outlaws and lost souls who see opportunity in the cracks. They imagine Rhodes is just another stage for their philosophy, another town to charm and exploit. They do not yet understand that Rhodes is a powder keg, and their presence is the match being struck in slow motion. When the dust of Valentine in the riverboat settles, there is no victory, only flight. The von der Linde gang rides into Lemoyne shaken and diminished, carrying the weight of Blackwater, the blood in Valentine, and a failed robbery that has left them broke, exposed, and hunted from every direction. The Pinkertons close in from the north. The law watches the railroads and the roads, and the gang's dream of freedom is already beginning to feel like a story told in the past tense. They arrive in Scarlet Meadows, not as conquering outlaws, but as refugees. The camp at Clemens Point is beautiful on the surface, a quiet inlet framed by moss-draped trees and lazy water, yet every choice made there is born of desperation. They need money. They need time. They need a place where civilization's gaze is turned inward, arguing with itself, rather than outward, hunting them. Dutch believes he has found exactly that in Rhodes. From the very beginning, Dutch reads Lemoyne as an opportunity wrapped in gentility. Rhodes appears civilized, almost quaint. A main street with a general store, a gunsmith, a saloon, and a sheriff who drinks coffee on the porch and tips his hat. Beneath that veneer, Dutch senses something else, something useful. The Braithwaite and Gray plantations dominate the horizon, vast estates built on old money, old blood, and the ghosts of slavery and war. Corrupt law, rich families, and a long simmering feud. For Dutch, this is the living embodiment of a world begging to be exploited. Arthur sees it differently. Riding through the swamps and along the white fences of Caliga Hall, he notices the beauty first. The golden fields, the still water, the birds rising out of the reeds. Then the unease. The slave quarters left standing, the monuments to Confederate dead, the way the locals speak about the war as if it ended yesterday. To Arthur, this is not a romantic stage for philosophy. It is a graveyard that never learned it was dead. Survival comes first. Jobs, money, keeping the family together as the old ways were dying. Dutch, though, looks at Catherine Braithwaite and Sheriff Lee Gray and sees reflections of himself. Powerful, proud, operating above the law, convinced they can bend this fading world to their will. In them, he recognizes his own belief that cleverness can outplay history, that charisma can tame corruption, that an outlaw with ideals can dance between two dynasties and walk away richer. Is it admiration, or the arrogance of thinking he is smarter than both sides? This is where the tragedy sharpens. Dutch decides not merely to hide near Rhodes, but to embed the gang between the Braithwaites and the Grays, to take work from each house, to inflame a feud already soaked in blood. From its humble beginnings as a search for shelter, his plan becomes a high-wire act above a powder keg. It will cost Sean his life, shatter the gang's illusion of safety, and set in motion the kidnapping that breaks Arthur's trust in the truest sense. Yet at Clemens Point, Under those peaceful trees, they still believe this southern interlude is their way back to power. They do not yet see the manor burning at the end of the road, or the child screaming from a departing carriage. That revelation comes next. They arrive in scarlet meadows under a veil of calm, riding through hanging moss and slow river fog, convinced this is a quiet chapter before the next great score. It feels peaceful. It feels safe. It is neither. At Clemens Point, the gang builds a new home among the cypress trees. The camp laid out with the same practiced rhythm as always. Tents go up, wagons are circled, chores are assigned. From its humble beginnings, this wandering caravan has become the living embodiment of Dutch's promise. Family on the move, civilization kept at arm's length, freedom claimed by rifle and rhetoric. Yet from the very beginning in Lemoyne, the ground under their bedrolls is already claimed by older powers. Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur ride into Rhodes not as raiders, but as surveyors of a new world to exploit. They keep their hats low, their guns holstered, their eyes open. Dutch talks with that practiced charm, feeling out prices, attitudes, and fears. Hosea listens more than he speaks, watching who defers to whom, who steps aside for whose horse, who carries themselves with the easy arrogance of inherited wealth. Hosea reads the town quickly. The sagging porches and faded paint speak of fortunes made on slaves and lost in the war. The old ways were dying, but the people who profited from them are still here, clinging on through tobacco, law, and liquor. He can sense it in the way names are spoken, or not spoken. Braithwaite lands heavy in the air. Gray travels on every tongue with a nervous respect. To Hosea, this is a story of old money and older grudges, and he knows that stepping between such families is a game that ends in blood. Dutch hears the same notes and imagines a different melody. Where Hosea sees danger, Dutch sees opportunity. Two houses, both decaying, both proud, both desperate to believe they still rule this corner of the world. What better stage for an idealistic outlaw philosopher who believes he can play civilization against itself? To him, Rhodes is not just a town, it is a chessboard. Arthur's role at first is smaller, quieter, almost domestic in the truest sense. He runs errands, buys supplies, and lets his presence feel routine. He talks to the general store owner about prices and hears complaints about Braithwaite moonshine flooding the county. He steps into the gunsmith and notices how the man glances at the window whenever a gray rider passes, lowering his voice without realizing it. At the saloon, over cheap whiskey, the locals gripe about taxes and law, but grow cagey when the sheriff's name is mentioned. Sheriff Lee Gray presents himself as genial, almost lazy, but Arthur sees the steel behind the smile. This lawman is no neutral arbiter. He is an extension of a family, a uniform wrapped around a plantation. When Gray deputies ride through town, they do it with an entitlement that makes ordinary men step off the boardwalk. Out on the roads, the Braithwaite presence is quieter, but no less real. Men linger by crossroads in fine but worn coats, watching passing riders with cold, measuring eyes. Wagons creak by under tarps that smell of strong liquor. A burned-out shack whispers of some past warning, never officially spoken of. Nobody admits fear. Everybody shows it. Arthur notices how conversation stalls when certain surnames are uttered, how a barkeep will suddenly find a new chore when questions drift too close to Caliga Hall or Braithwaite Manor. Invisible lines run through Rhodes, dividing who sits where, who speaks first, who pretends not to see what. The gang has ridden into a town already at war with itself, even if the shooting has not yet started on Main Street. Then comes the pattern interrupt, the moment Dutch stops thinking of Scarlet Meadows as a temporary hideout and starts treating it as destiny. Standing on the dock at Clemens Point, watching the sun bleed over the water, he tells Hosea and Arthur that they have stumbled into something rare. Two decaying empires, both blind to their own weakness. Why rob a single bank when entire dynasties are rotting on the vine? Hosea counsels caution, warning that families who built their thrones on chains and cotton do not surrender quietly. He knows that in a world where the old ways were dying, men like the Grays and Braithwaites will burn everything before they admit defeat. But Dutch is already moving pieces in his mind. He will smile for the Grays, flatter the Braithwaites, and promise each that the gang is theirs to use. To Dutch, this is more than a swampy refuge. This is a grand experiment, proof that his philosophy still works in a changing world. He believes he can walk into the feud, take their money, and ride away untouched. He believes he can befriend both sides without becoming their weapon. He believes he can leave Rhodes with all the winnings. He is wrong, but that revelation, and the bodies that come with it, still lie just beyond the next ride into town. Dutch is wrong about the feud, but the proof of that failure does not arrive with gunfire or dynamite. It arrives in the quiet figure of Beau Gray, standing on a Rhodes street corner, hands trembling around a bundle of letters he is too afraid to mail himself. Beau is a Gray in name, but not in spirit. Born into Caliga Hall's decaying grandeur, he has been raised on stories of honor, lineage, and Southern pride. Yet every day he watches his relatives enforce that pride with fists, whips, and rifles. He is gentle, nervous, the living embodiment of a man crushed between family loyalty and private conscience. The world was changing, and Beau knew it. The old ways were dying, even if his uncles would rather burn Lemoyne than admit it. Across the fields at Braithwaite Manor, Penelope Braithwaite is caught in the same trap, only sharper. Educated, idealistic, and restless, she reads newspapers and pamphlets that her family calls dangerous, studies suffragette speeches, and dreams of a world where women can vote and men are not measured by the slaves they once owned. In the truest sense, she is a prisoner in silk, disgusted by her family's racism and violence, watching Catherine Braithwaite cling to a plantation philosophy built on ghosts and ash. From this poisoned soil grows a forbidden romance, a story of hope inside a landscape of hatred. Beau and Penelope meet in hidden spots along the shore and in overgrown gardens, heirs of warring houses whispering about freedom instead of inheritance. They are a southern Romeo and Juliet, fully aware that discovery could mean a bullet in the back or a body in the swamp. What future can exist for two lost souls who refuse to hate the way their families demand? Arthur stumbles into their world almost by accident. Dutch sends him to Rhodes to play both sides, and Arthur finds himself doing something that barely looks criminal at all, delivering letters between Beau and Penelope, escorting Penelope to suffragette protests in St. Denis, trying to keep a nervous Gray from fainting in front of a crowd of angry men. It seems light, almost comic, two outlaws chaperoning a romance while pretending to be farmhands. But each small act exposes the depth of the feud. The Grays threaten Beau, the Braithwaites threaten Penelope, and the sight of a Braithwaite girl marching for women's rights is treated as treason. Through them, the true nature of the feud comes into focus. For Dutch, Rhodes is a game board, its family's resources to be milked in service of a grand plan. For Beau and Penelope, it is a prison they are desperate to escape. One sees opportunity in inherited hatred, the other two see only chains. Their dreams of escape will collide with Dutch's schemes soon enough, when letters and protests give way to ambushes and kidnappings. And when that happens, the price of underestimating this little love story will be paid in blood. For Penelope, those dreams of escape crash every morning against the same four walls. Braithwaite Manor is grand, but for her it is a gilded cell, a story of wealth turned into a cage. From its humble beginnings as a plantation palace, the house has become the living embodiment of a dead philosophy, and Catherine Braithwaite is its warden. Penelope's days are measured, not lived. Servants report where she walks in the gardens, which books vanish from the library, how long she lingers near the road that leads toward Rhodes and Caliga Hall. Letters are intercepted, visitors screened, conversations overheard through half-closed doors. At every turn, Catherine reminds her that a Braithwaite woman does not wander, does not question, does not forget who burned their fields and killed their men. Freedom, in the truest sense, is treated as childish fantasy. Catherine's worldview has fossilized with the manor itself. The world was changing outside Scarlet Meadows, but inside, the old ways were dying in slow motion, not with reflection, but with denial. Women marching for the vote in St. Denis? To Catherine, they are hysterical clowns. Talk of equality between races or between the Braithwaites and the Grays. Delusions, she insists, spread by carpetbaggers and cowards. The feud is presented as sacred history, a blood-written scripture that her granddaughter must memorize and defend. What is honor? Catherine asks, if not loyalty to that ancient hatred. Yet Penelope's mind keeps reaching beyond the swamp. In hidden corners of the library, she reads banned pamphlets on suffrage and abolition, pages smuggled in with novels and newspapers. She writes secret letters to Beau Gray, words of affection threaded with questions about a different world, one where family means chosen bonds rather than inherited chains. She lingers by the property line to speak with workers and travelers, listening to their stories of cities, unions, and a frontier where old titles mean nothing. Each quiet act is small. Together, they are rebellion. This is not just a choice between two suitors meeting under a willow tree. Penelope is standing at the fault line between past and future, between loyalty and betrayal, between the comfort of complicity and the terror of stepping into an unknown civilization that has no place for Southern royalty. If she stays, she helps preserve a violent legacy of moonshine, human misery, and petty war. If she leaves, what remains of her name, her home, her safety. Catherine senses the drift, and suspicion hardens into threat. Questions about where Penelope walks become accusations. Locked doors appear where there were none. Offhand remarks turn sharp. A Braithwaite who disgraces the family will be treated worse than any Gray. The message is clear. If Penelope keeps reaching for that fragile dream of freedom, the response from her own blood will not be gentle correction. It will be ruthless, calculated punishment, and the first move in that punishment is already being planned. While Catherine sharpens punishment at Braithwaite Manor, across the marsh at Caliga Hall, another prison tightens its grip. If Penelope is the family's wild spark, then Beau Gray is its quiet ember, smoldering in the shadow of a house that demands fire. From the very beginning, his life has been mapped out for him. A Gray man, a Rhodes gentleman, the future of Lemoyne's tobacco royalty. On paper, Beau is everything Caliga Hall should want. He is educated, presentable, able to stand beside Sheriff Lee Gray in town and assure merchants that the family business is stable. His duties clear. Endorse the tobacco shipments. Smile through the bribes, echo the old jokes about Braithwaite degeneracy. The world was changing, but in these halls the old ways were dying very slowly, preserved in ledgers, portraits, and whispered slurs. Beau is expected to nod along, to treat the feud as tradition, an inheritance in the truest sense. Yet every time he watches Tavish Gray berate a tenant, or hears Lee dismiss a beating as just discipline, something in him recoils. Tavish and Lee read that recoil as weakness. They call him soft, question his loyalty, remind him that Rhodes' law is Gray law, and that civilization itself, in their twisted philosophy, depends on men willing to do what he will not. Their world is binary. Braithwaite or Gray, strength or shame, victory or humiliation. Where does a man who hesitates fit into that? This tension comes into focus when Arthur Morgan enters his orbit. Their meetings are almost ironic. A reluctant heir to a plantation dynasty asking an outlaw for help in sending love letters. Beau speaks in apologies, half whispers, and nervous glances, as if every word might be overheard by Caliga's walls. He knows the feud is a story of loyalty and betrayal, dreams and delusions, and he fears the next chapter will be written in blood. When Arthur mentions work for both families, Beau is quietly horrified, sensing that mercenary hands will only stoke the fire. To Beau, Penelope is not only a forbidden love, she is the living embodiment of escape. She mocks their family's pretensions, questions the war, the plantations, the entire philosophy that props up Rhodes. Through her, Beau glimpses a different world, one where freedom is not measured in acreage or political office, but in the ability to step away from all of this. Is it any wonder their letters sound less like romance and more like a jailbreak plan? Yet his rebellion remains quiet. He refuses to endorse the worst Gray tactics, drags his feet on certain errands, and avoids the backroom conversations where Tavish, Lee, and their more ruthless kin plot. That absence has a cost. Marginalized in his own house, Beau becomes a spectator as harder men seize the reins. In that vacuum, decisions are made that invite the van der Linde gang deeper into Rhodes and set up the ambush that will stain its streets red. The tragedy is simple. The man who might have argued for restraint has already been pushed to the margins, dreaming of flight with a Braithwaite girl, while Caliga Hall prepares for war it believes it cannot lose. The next move will not be written in ink or sealed with wax. It will be written with gunfire, and when that gunfire comes, Rhodes will never be the same. Gunfire will decide the future of Rhodes, but before the first shot is fired, Dutch tries something far more dangerous than a gunfight. He tries a gamble. In his mind, this is not just another scheme. This is the move that will pull the gang out of poverty and back toward the grand dreams that once defined them. He gathers them at Clemens Point and lays it out with theatrical calm. The Braithwaites and the Grays, he says, are old money in a dying world, the living embodiment of everything the gang has always claimed to stand against. They are rich, arrogant, and blinded by a feud so ancient that no one can quite remember the very beginning. What better marks could an outlaw family ask for? Dutch promises that the gang will play both sides, take both paydays, and never truly belong to either cause. To Dutch, this is not simple greed, it is philosophy. He paints it as justice in the truest sense. These families built their fortunes on slavery, on chains and auctions, on blood spilled to protect fields of cotton and tobacco. Now, as the world was changing and the old ways were dying, he insists that taking their money is not theft, but a correction. Why should men and women running from civilization starve, while those who once owned human beings still drink fine wine on wide verandas? The plan begins quietly. Arthur, Bill, and others ride into Rhodes under the watchful eye of Sheriff Lee Gray, taking work as hired guns, guarding wagons, escorting tobacco shipments, pretending to be useful, loyal muscle. At the same time, Hosea, Javier, and Trelawney move in the opposite direction, toward Braithwaite Manor, asking polite questions, hinting at services, letting Catherine Braithwaite believe she is the one doing the manipulating. Each family thinks it is using a band of drifters to hurt its enemies. In truth, both are already feeding the same hungry beast. There is a certain dark irony here. Two proud dynasties, each convinced of its own superiority, quietly paying the same outlaws to undermine the other. Dutch can almost taste the victory. Every job that goes smoothly, every coin that changes hands without consequence, feeds his growing excitement. This, to him, feels like a return to from its humble beginnings, when he and Hosea would bleed the rich and ride away laughing. Hosea does not laugh. He studies the verandas, the portraits, the guarded glances between servants and masters, and he sees something Dutch refuses to see. Old families with long memories do not treat betrayal as business. They treat it as religion. Hosea warns Dutch that they are walking into a story of loyalty and betrayal written generations before the gang was born. Dutch waves it off, insisting that brains and bravado will outmatch rusted pride, and there lies the flaw that will poison everything. Dutch believes he is sitting at a card table outplaying two arrogant opponents. The Braithwaites and the Grays believe they are defending sacred ground, sacred honor, a sacred past. One man thinks in wagers and exits. Two houses think in oaths and blood. When those worlds collide, who really walks away? The answer will not come in coin. It will come in corpses. That answer begins with a badge. Not a gunfight, not a raid, but a small tin star pinned to Arthur Morgan's chest, turning an outlaw into law with one casual gesture. In Rhodes, this is a story of symbols, and no symbol is emptier than that star. Sheriff Lee Gray does the honors. In the cramped, sun-dusted office off the main street, he plays the genial host, the living embodiment of small-town order. He laughs about needing extra hands, about the town being rough around the edges, about how civilization needs a firm touch. Yet from the very beginning, the badge is presented less as duty and more as a favor, a family arrangement. Arthur is not sworn in as a servant of justice. He is hired on as another Gray employee. The first jobs make that perfectly clear. Lee rides with Arthur to bust up a moonshine ring, talking all the while about law and decency and the moral rot of the Braithwaites. On paper, it sounds idealistic, cleaning up illegal stills, shutting down poison flowing through Lemoyne. In practice, the targets are Braithwaite-linked operations, competitors encroaching on Gray-controlled smuggling and tobacco interests. Barrels are smashed, shacks are burned, men are threatened, but the real message is territorial. This is Grayland. Another day, Arthur helps clean up Rhodes itself. Drunks are roughed up, troublemakers warned, a few unlucky souls hauled in for show. Lee smiles through it all, easy and charming, joking about paperwork he will never file, about fines that somehow always end up in Gray pockets. He presents himself as reasonable, almost weary, a man doing what must be done in a changing world. But in offhand remarks, the mask slips. He spits the Braithwaite name with contempt. He talks about keeping old families where they belong. The law, in the truest sense, is just another Gray fence line. For Arthur, this creates a quiet, gnawing tension. Dutch's philosophy has always painted the gang as rebels against a rigged system, enemies of corrupt law and bought judges. Yet here is Dutch's right hand, wearing a star, enforcing the very civilization Dutch claims to despise. The work pays, the access is useful, and the gang's dreams of a big score demand compromise. Still, each ride with Lee blurs the line between infiltrating power and becoming part of it. How different is this from the Pinkertons, really, when the badge serves money instead of principle? Beneath the polite talk and lazy charm, something colder lurks. Lee's deputies move with quiet efficiency. The office has ledgers, coded notes, a steady flow of messages between Rhodes and Caliga Hall. The Grays are not just a fading plantation family. They are organized, disciplined, prepared. The old ways were dying, but the Grays have learned how to dress old brutality in new respectability. Arthur's time as a deputy feels temporary, almost theatrical. Yet the stage is being set. When this family decides to stop smiling and start shooting, that same organization will turn Rhodes from Sleepytown into killing ground, and the man who wore their star will be standing right in the middle of it. Arthur's tin star in Rhodes is barely cold when Dutch sends him back into the mud, this time without a badge, and with Hosea at his side. If the Grays are the public face of order, the Braithwaites are the shadow underneath, and Dutch wants both. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, the gang will play deputy by day and bootlegger by night. Their entry point is moonshine. Hosea and Arthur take jobs moving Braithwaite liquor, riding ramshackle wagons through the swamps while pretending to be harmless hired hands. On one run, the job is simple transport. On another, the job is to sabotage rival shipments, turning crates of liquor into kindling and leaving the Lemoyne raiders drunk, furious, and dangerous. Each burned barrel is money lost for someone, but for Dutch it is information gained. Those runs pull them deeper into the wetlands south of Rhodes, where the Braithwaites' real empire hides. Stills squat in the cypress like rusted idols, copper and wood half swallowed by fog and mosquitoes. Rough Braithwaite men, ex-Confederates, and local allies stand guard with shotguns and old uniforms, the living embodiment of a plantation class that refuses to die. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but here in the reeds, the war never really ended. Hosea watches all of it with a conman's eye. He sees the routes, the contacts, the quiet nods between moonshiners and Rhodes merchants. This is not a side hustle. This is infrastructure. The Braithwaites have turned whiskey into a parallel economy, a black market lifeline that keeps their decaying estate afloat while civilization pretends not to notice. Every delivery teaches Hosea where the money flows and where the Braithwaites are weak. Then Catherine Braithwaite invites them in. Braithwaite Manor, from its humble beginnings as a plantation house, has become a mausoleum for a ruined dynasty. But Catherine plays hostess with venomous grace. She serves drinks on the veranda, flatters Dutch's philosophy, and laughs at Hosea's stories, all while letting her contempt for outsiders bleed through every word. Is this hospitality or a test? Both, in the truest sense. Hosea reads her faster than Dutch does. Behind the lace and the drawl, he senses a predator as dangerous and cunning as Dutch himself, only stripped of illusion. Dutch still talks about freedom and family. Catherine talks about survival and revenge. She has generational hatred, a burned-out legacy, and nothing left to lose. To her, these visiting outlaws are not partners. They are tools. And that is the quiet tragedy beneath the clinking glasses and moonlit wagon rides. While the gang believes they are conning both sides of a provincial feud, Catherine is already measuring ranges, weighing tempers, and imagining how these new guns might be turned on the Grays. Once the shooting starts, what use is an outlaw who knows too much about the family business? In her mind, the von der Linde gang is already marked as weapon first, collateral second. Catherine is not the only one watching. As the days roll on, the gang's work in Lemoyne becomes a story of small errands with enormous shadows, of routine favors that quietly bend a feud toward open war. On paper, these are simple town jobs. In practice, they are sparks being carried into a powder room that has been waiting since the very beginning. Arthur escorts gray tobacco wagons through Rhodes, shotgun across his knees, trading dead-eyed stares with Braithwaite hands on the roadside. Another day, he rides with Sean or Bill to encourage a delinquent debtor who owes Lee Gray protection money, dragging the man out into the street while the sheriff looks on with feigned reluctance. The next morning, the same outlaw is seen trotting up the Braithwaite Drive, delivering a sealed letter that just happens to insult Gray honor in terms too precise to be coincidence. Every message carried, every wagon guarded is framed as business. Everyone is a provocation. The town notices. Rhodes is small, its main street a stage where everyone knows the cast. Shopkeepers watch Arthur ride in wearing gray colors, then see him later laughing with Hosea near Braithwaite wagons loaded with moonshine. Stable boys whisper that the same horses are being brushed down after trips to Caliga Hall and Braithwaite Manor. In a world where loyalty is supposed to be simple, this wandering allegiance becomes the living embodiment of rumor. Who are these men really working for? Who will they betray first? Lee Gray, with his badge that means less than his surname, begins to probe. Over whiskey in the sheriff's office, he asks Arthur and Dutch hypothetical questions about where their loyalties lie, about what they would do if one plantation went too far. He makes half jokes about hanging outlaws who talk to the wrong people, watching for the smallest flinch. A missing ledger page appears, then reappears, just to see who asks about it. The philosophy is simple. Pressure reveals truth. At Braithwaite Manor, Catherine plays the same game with older, colder tools. She sends Arthur on errands that overlap Gray interests, then casually inquires whether Lee mentions certain names. She repeats details only Dutch's camp should know, gauging which outlaw stiffens. She hints that she has friends in St. Denis who dislike double dealers, and lets that threat hang in the humid air. In the truest sense, both matriarch and sheriff are circling the same question. Are these newcomers weapons, or are they a disease? Arthur feels it before anyone says it aloud. The air in Rhodes grows heavier. as if the humidity itself has turned suspicious. Conversations on porches end when an unfamiliar horse clops by. Men who once joked with the gang now nod in silence, one hand never far from a holster. Freedom begins to feel narrower, the streets tighter, the exits fewer. The old ways were dying, and with them the luxury of being just passing outlaws. Dutch, of course, only sees opportunity. The more tension rises, the bigger the scores he imagines. Sabotage shipments, staged robberies, a grand play that will fleece both families and send the gang riding out rich. But each new job deepens the impression that the von der Linde gang is playing both ends against the middle. In a town ruled by wounded pride and generational hate, how long before one family decides to make an example of the outsiders? The first shot has not been fired yet. It is coming all the same. The first shot has not been fired yet, but in Rhodes, the fuse is already burning. And in the middle of that slow explosion stand two people who want nothing to do with a war their ancestors started. Penelope Braithwaite has been fighting her own quiet war from the very beginning. While Catherine clings to the old codes of plantation nobility, Penelope slips away to meet the Lemoyne suffragettes, marching under banners that demand votes for women in a county that still mourns the Confederacy. When Arthur escorts that protest through Rhodes, the scene becomes a story of two futures colliding. Prim women in white dresses chanting for rights, surrounded by men who would rather draw guns than grant them dignity. The townsfolk jeer, the deputies smirk. Yet Penelope does not back down. In the truest sense, she is the living embodiment of a world that might be, standing in front of families chained to what once was. Her friendship with Beau Gray, nervous and bookish, grows in that same tension between idealism and fear, between dreams of freedom and the suffocating weight of family loyalty. Both houses feel it. Both move to crush it. Catherine Braithwaite threatens to lock Penelope away, to marry her off to a proper suitor and erase this embarrassing flirtation with a Gray. Over at Caliga Hall, Tavish Gray and his kin warn Beau that a Braithwaite bride would mean betrayal, that he will be disowned, cut off from land, money, and name. What is love against tobacco fields, moonshine roots, and a century of hate? The pressure escalates from whispers to ultimatums, from stern talks in drawing rooms to open threats of violence. Penelope is told she will marry for the family. Beau is told he will fight for the family. Neither is asked what kind of world they want to live in as the old ways were dying around them. So they do something unthinkable in a county where every road bends back to blood and inheritance. They decide to run. From its humble beginnings as a secret correspondence, their romance becomes an escape plan, and Arthur Morgan, outlaw and reluctant matchmaker, agrees to help. The mission to get them on a train turns their love story into a literal attempt to outrun Lemoyne's gravity, to flee the philosophy of vengeance that rules both plantations. Their farewell is quiet, almost painfully small against the decaying grandeur of their homes. Penelope leaves Braithwaite Manor, its rotting balconies and faded portraits, watching her step into a future her ancestors never imagined. Beau turns his back on Caliga Hall, on fields that fed his family's pride and their delusions in equal measure. Each knows this walk down the lane may be the last. They reach the platform, they hesitate, then, together, they board. For a moment, there is real hope, a rare victory in a story of loss. But as the train pulls away, Rhodes and Scarlet Meadows remain behind, armed, wounded, and waiting. Their departure will not stop what is coming. In fact, it may be the last mercy this land ever sees before the shooting finally starts. Clemens Point feels, for a brief and treacherous season, almost like home. The gang's tents curve along the shore in a rough crescent, canvas and rope framed by cypress trees and hanging moss, with the lake breathing quietly at their feet. At night, firelight ripples across the black water, turning the camp into a floating reflection, a fragile island of warmth in a world closing in. By day, the violence of Rhodes and the plantation seems distant. Children chase each other between laundry lines. Pearson curses gently over boiling pots, and the air carries the smell of coffee, tobacco, and wet earth. Men who once lived by the gun now spend slow afternoons with fishing rods in hand, lines cast out into the glassy lake as if freedom could be hooked and hauled in. It is a story of outlaws pretending, in the truest sense, to be settlers. Routine takes hold. Javier strums his guitar while Karen and Tilly sing, their voices drifting across the water. Uncle lounges against a barrel, offering lazy commentary on Dutch's philosophy and everyone else's work ethic. Charles returns with game slung over his shoulder. Sadie sharpens knives with a focus that makes even hardened men step carefully. Around the crates and campfires, The gang becomes the living embodiment of a wandering family trying to pause time. Yet beneath the music and the laughter, the world was changing. News from Rhodes arrives with every rider. More whispers about Braithwaites and Grays, more talk of moonshine, tobacco, and old money refusing to die. Around one fire, Bill and Micah argue that Dutch's plan to play both families is genius, the smartest way out since Blackwater. Around another, Hosea, Susan, and Charles trade uneasy glances and quiet doubts. How deep can they sink into Lemoyne's politics before there is no way back? Dutch walks through camp with sermons ready, promising that this is only temporary, that from its humble beginnings at Coulter to this peaceful bay, every hardship has led toward one final score. To some, his words are scripture. To others, they sound more and more like delusions dressed as destiny. Loyalty and betrayal begin to blur long before anyone pulls a trigger. Arthur feels it most in the silences. In his journal, he sketches the curve of the shoreline, the lanterns swinging from branches, the way the moonlight turns the lake to silver. He writes about the comfort of Clemens Point, about the rare peace of listening to frogs and crickets instead of gunfire. But between the lines, doubt seeps through. Dutch is dealing with slavers and aristocrats, with sheriffs who sell the law. The old ways were dying, yet Dutch keeps chasing a dream rooted in them. Arthur starts to wonder, is he following a leader or a lost soul who cannot admit the frontier is gone? Then the pattern breaks. One evening, as the songs fade and the fire burns low, a single gunshot echoes faintly across the lake from the direction of Rhodes. Moments later, a lone rider appears at the tree line, horse-lathered, eyes wide, bringing urgent news from town. The calm at Clemens Point, always an illusion, begins to crack. The shot is distant, but its meaning is close. The season of safety is over, and the road toward Braithwaite Manor and Caliga Hall is already waiting in the dark. The urgent rider from Rhodes does not bring a call to arms against the Braithwaites. He brings an invitation, a promise, a trap dressed up as opportunity in the truest sense of Southern hospitality turned venomous. Lee Gray comes to Clemens Point with that calm, measured charm that has already fooled so many in this fading corner of Lemoyne. He speaks of honor, of restoring his family's standing, of finally striking a decisive blow against those moonshining degenerates at Braithwaite Manor. Beneath the politeness, he offers Dutch exactly what Dutch wants to hear, a story of one last big job that will make all the small humiliations in Rhodes worth it. A bank coach, he says, heavy with Braithwaite gold, rolling right through town under the sheriff's watchful eye. From the very beginning of this feud, Dutch has treated Rhodes as a chessboard. Now he believes he sees checkmate. He gathers Arthur, Bill, Javier, and the others around the fire, and lays it out as if it were destiny. The Grays are desperate, the Braithwaites are vulnerable, and civilization itself is closing in. This score, he insists, will buy them freedom from Lemoyne and a new start further west. Who could turn that down? Arthur, though, hears something else in Leahy's smooth assurances. The Grays have lied before. The sheriff's office has always been the living embodiment of Gray power, not neutral law. Charles, grim and observant, points out how much the gang is now walking in daylight, how often Gray men seem to appear just where they are not wanted. Even Hosea, already worried that Dutch is chasing dreams instead of safety, questions how much trust can be placed in a family that built its fortune on tobacco, intimidation, and quiet murder. Dutch listens, but only to answer. He frames their doubts as fear, their caution as a failure of faith in his philosophy. Had they not survived Blackwater? Had they not outplayed the Braithwaites already? The world was changing, he tells them, and bold men must seize what they can before the old ways were dying completely. It sounds persuasive. It is also delusion. While Dutch talks of destiny, Lee Gray talks logistics. In Rhodes, preparations begin. Men loyal to Caliga Hall drift to town in twos and threes, pretending to be farmhands and drifters, then vanish into upper rooms. Hired guns arrive off the train and never check into the hotel under their real names. Rifles are carried in crates marked tools and seed, carried up narrow stairways to rooftops overlooking the main street. The sheriff's office becomes both bait and command center. Lee positions deputies at doors and windows, not to protect the gang, but to seal the exits. Messages move quietly between the jail cells and Caliga Hall, tying the town's law and its plantation power into one net. By the time Dutch gives the word to ride, Rhodes is no longer a sleepy crossroads. It is a killing ground. The ride-in feels wrong, even before the first shot. The streets are too orderly, too empty for market day. A curtain twitches and does not close. A shopkeeper sweeps a clean doorstep, eyes fixed on the approaching riders. Arthur feels the weight of those stares, the way the whole town seems to be holding its breath, as if civilization itself is waiting for a verdict. Still, loyalty drives them forward. Dutch dismounts first, coat flaring, every inch the outlaw general he believes himself to be. The gang follows, boots hitting the dust in a slow, fateful rhythm as they walk toward the sheriff's office and the promise of Braithwaite gold. Above them, unseen in the shadowed windows and along the angled rooftops, rifle barrels are already trained on their backs. The trap is not springing yet. It is simply waiting, patient and precise, for the moment Dutch steps through that door. The door swings open. Dutch steps through with that easy, performative charm, and for one suspended heartbeat, Rhodes is exactly what it pretends to be: a sleepy town, a polite sheriff, a civilized arrangement between outlaw and lawman. Then Sean's head explodes. One moment he's laughing, throwing some quick, cutting joke over his shoulder, the living embodiment of the gang's reckless confidence. The next, a sniper's bullet tears through his skull, and the joke dies in his throat as his body drops boneless into the dust. There is no warning shot, no shouted threat, no chance for bravado, just a red mist in the afternoon light and a story of freedom and family suddenly interrupted by brutal reality. The silence breaks all at once. Rifles crack from the rooftops, from curtained windows, from the same balconies that had watched the gang ride in as paying customers. Glass shatters, horses rear, townsfolk scream and hurl themselves behind barrels and wagons as bullets chew apart the tidy main street from its humble beginnings at the station to the steps of the sheriff's office. In seconds, the pleasant facade of Rhodes becomes a killing ground. Arthur dives for cover, dragging Sean's twitching body behind a trough that splinters under the next volley. Shock hits first, a cold, hollow disbelief that this loudmouthed Irishman who had just returned to the fold could be gone so quickly, without last words or heroics. Then rage follows, hot and focused, burning away the remnants of Dutch's idealistic talk about partnership and opportunity in Lemoyne. The Grays have answered that philosophy with a firing squad. Through the smoke and chaos, Arthur sees it clearly. Sheriff Lee Gray, the courteous host who shook hands and shared plans, stands framed in the office doorway, shotgun in hand, giving orders as calmly as if directing traffic. The law in Rhodes, in the truest sense, was never neutral. It was a family business, a mask of civilization stretched over old money and older grudges. Now the mask is gone. The gang scrambles, returning fire from overturned wagons and doorways, dragging the wounded and shouting over the roar of gunfire. Javier and Bill lay down covering shots at the snipers on the roofs. Dutch barks commands, half tactical, half desperate, trying to turn an execution into a retreat. Every step back through town is paid for in blood and splintered wood, each familiar storefront now a potential firing position. As they fight their way toward the horses, Arthur keeps one hand on his rifle and the other on Sean's body, refusing to leave him in this street that had once promised easy money. The dream of a quiet exit from Lemoyne dies with every fallen Gray gunman and every civilian caught in the crossfire. The old ways were dying, but not peacefully. They were dragging everyone down with them. By the time the surviving outlaws burst out of Rhodes, they are no longer business partners, but declared enemies, hauling Sean's corpse and a new certainty. The Grays have chosen open war, and somewhere in the smoke behind them, another betrayal is already taking shape, waiting to strike at the gang's most vulnerable point. War follows them out of Rhodes. Back at camp, the silence says more than the shouting. Sean's body is laid out under the trees, red hair dark with drying blood, and the gang gathers in a rough circle that feels more like a broken family than a crew of outlaws. Grief hangs heavy. Bill fumes. Javier curses the Grays. Karen drinks until her hands stop shaking. Even Hosea, so often the voice of restraint, looks older, smaller, as if the world was changing faster than his philosophy can keep up. Dutch watches all of it. He sees the tears, the clenched fists, the way Arthur stands over Sean's corpse with that hollow stare of a lost soul who has buried too many brothers already. For a moment, there is room for sorrow. Then Dutch does what Dutch always does. He turns pain into purpose. Sean's death becomes not just a tragedy, but a justification. A story of betrayal, of partners who dared to treat the von der Linde gang as disposable. He calls them together and gives the anger direction. The Grays have cheated them, tried to wipe them out in the street, and murdered one of their own under a white flag of business. So Dutch reframes the whole feud. This is no longer a petty plantation squabble. This is principle, in the truest sense. Freedom against corruption, loyalty against treachery. The gang will not slink away into the swamps. They will answer with fire and lead. The plan is brutal and simple. Hit Callagahol hard and fast, under cover of distraction and darkness. Ride in armed to the teeth. burn the tobacco fields that have funded Grey power since before the Civil War, and kill the men who run the operation. Not every Grey needs to die, Dutch insists, only those who stand in the way. But the subtext is clear. This will be a message written in smoke over Scarlet Meadows. Who will dare betray them after this? Night falls soft over Lemoyne, but the gang rides out sharp. Hooves drum through the marsh roads as Arthur, John, Bill, Javier, and the others move in formation, shadows among the cypress. Caliga Hall looms ahead, the living embodiment of the old ways that were dying but refusing to lie down. Guards pace the verandas. Wagons creak. Somewhere inside, Tavish Gray still believes his family can manage chaos. Then the first torch hits the first row of tobacco. The plants go up with a hungry roar, dry leaves catching and leaping, lines of green turning to walls of orange. Flames race down the furrows, decades of Grey wealth igniting in seconds. It is not just revenge. It is the literal burning of Old South Capital, a plantation empire collapsing into ash. How many generations have lived off this soil, off the backs of the enslaved and the poor, only to see it all vanish in one outlaw raid? Gunfire answers the fire. Grey men spill from the house and outbuildings, some half-dressed, some dragging rifles, all of them stumbling into a battlefield they never expected. The fight is close and vicious. Arthur and Charles use the smoke as cover, cutting down defenders at fences and wagon lines. John pushes through the courtyard, trading shots at near point-blank range. Bill, in his element, lays down wild, deafening fire that keeps the Greys pinned while the flames close in. There is a moment of dark irony in the chaos. The self-proclaimed guardians of law and order in Rhodes, men who hid behind Sheriff Lee Gray's badge and Caliga Hall's respectability, reduced to panicked silhouettes running through their own burning fields. Civilization, stripped of its fine clothes, looks a lot like any other gunfight in the mud. By the time the smoke begins to thin, the outcome is clear. Key Grey men lie dead in the dirt, their workers scattered, their fortune quite literally up in flames. Caliga Hall itself still stands, scarred but not destroyed, its columns blackened and windows shattered, a wounded monument to a dying world. The Greys are broken and leaderless, their political machine in Rhodes crippled. Dutch surveys the ruin and convinces himself the score is settled. Sean is avenged, the gang's reputation restored, and the path ahead seemingly cleared of one more obstacle. From its humble beginnings as a simple business arrangement, the Rhodes venture has become a story of open war and violent retribution, and Dutch believes, for a fleeting moment, that he has bent that chaos to his will. But the fire at Caliga Hall does not burn in isolation. Across the water at Braithwaite Manor, Catherine Braithwaite watches the glow on the horizon and understands exactly what it means. The old feud has been dragged into a new, bloodier chapter, and the outlaws she has been toying with have just proved how far they will go. Dutch thinks he has closed a book. In truth, he has pushed Catherine past restraint, and the next move in this game will not be his to make. Catherine Braithwaite watches the flames on the horizon and understands something Dutch does not. This is not an ending, but an opening. The old ways were dying, the old plantation order crumbling under debt and whiskey. Yet in this fire she sees one last chance to strike back at a world that has forgotten her name. From its humble beginnings, the Braithwaite, Gray feud had been a story of wounded pride and inherited hatred, but Catherine's thoughts now are colder, narrower, and far more precise. The Greys lie broken in the streets of Rhodes, their sheriff dead, their sons shot down by the very outlaws they hired. The law is in disarray, Pinkertons are distant, and the Van der Linde gang has just bared its throat. Why chase Dutch Van der Linde's guns when his heart sits unguarded in a muddy camp by the lake? She has watched them, listened to reports from servants and riders, an idealistic outlaw preaching freedom, a camp that plays at being a family, a small boy at the center of it all. Jack Marston is not a threat in the usual sense. He is the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy turned domestic, the proof that this roaming band believes it can build a home in the ruins of civilization. So Catherine chooses not to challenge Dutch head-on, but to cut into that illusion. The plan is simple in outline and vicious in detail. Her men spread rumors through Rhodes of O'Driscoll's nearby, of a stagecoach ripe for the taking, of a lead on the Blackwater money that has haunted Dutch since the very beginning. Messages are passed. Friends of the gang whisper opportunities, and Dutch, hungry for a decisive score, sends his best riders chasing ghosts. While the adults scatter in pursuit of profit and revenge, the Braithwaites move on the camp, a quiet approach through the trees, a servant's wagon as cover. a soft voice promising Jack a short ride and a surprise. In the truest sense, it is a kidnapping born not of chaos but of clarity. When the gang returns to find the boy gone, the silence hits harder than any gunshot. Abigail's panic tears through the camp, a mother's scream cutting through Dutch's speeches and Micah's bravado. John's guilt is immediate and corrosive. Every absence, every selfish ride, every failure as a father crashes down on him at once. Arthur feels something different, heavier. The realization that their games with Southern royalty have dragged an innocent child into a war that was never his. This is no longer just a story of feuds and robberies. This is a family being torn apart. For Catherine, the motives are layered. She wants revenge for Dutch's meddling, for the moonshine raids, for the burning of gray men she had intended to ruin slowly. She wants leverage, a bargaining chip to lure Dutch to Braithwaite Manor and end his interference in Lemoyne on her terms. And beneath that, there is a twisted echo of her own history, of children buried and heirs lost, of how the world was changing and tearing old families limb from limb. The message she leaves behind is chilling in its simplicity. A taunting note, a clear direction. Jack is at Braithwaite Manor. No ransom, no negotiation, just an invitation to walk into the lion's den. The gang understands what it means. Dutch sees an insult to his authority. John sees a father's last chance. Arthur sees a suicide mission they cannot refuse. As they saddle their horses and ride toward the burning heart of Scarlet Meadows, the line between freedom and civilization, between loyalty and betrayal, narrows to a single choice. Abandon the boy, or march straight into Catherine's trap and accept whatever fate waits in the lantern-lit halls ahead. They ride into the dark as if into a verdict. Hooves drum through the wet earth of Scarlet Meadows, lanterns and torches bobbing in a ragged line, the Van der Linde gang cutting a trail of firelight through a world that feels ready to swallow them whole. Thunder mutters over the bayou, distant but growing, as if the sky itself is weighing what this night will cost. From its humble beginnings, this feud was about land, pride, and old money, but the ride to Braithwaite Manor turns it into something else entirely. Faces are hard and set. Dutch leans forward in the saddle, jaw clenched, his coat snapping in the wind. John rides with a hollow stare, every stride of his horse a question. Is his son still alive? Arthur sits between them in the truest sense, the living embodiment of the gang's conscience and its violence, knowing this is no longer a story of clever cons and easy scores. This is a march to drag a child out of hell. The manor rises from the trees in a pale silhouette, its white columns catching the first flicker of approaching fire. Braithwaite men already wait on the porch and along the veranda, rifles glinting, shadows long and ready. There is no parley, no last warning. The gang swings down from their horses and forms a rough line in the drive, torches behind them, guns in their hands, advancing across the gravel with the slow inevitability of a firing squad. For a moment, old Southern royalty and wandering outlaws simply stare at each other, two dying worlds meeting at the end of the road. Then the first shot cracks, and civilization's thin veneer shatters. Bullets tear into the columns, sending white plaster and splinters spraying across the steps. Glass bursts from the tall windows as Braithwaite riflemen fire from the balconies, their silhouettes flashing in the muzzle flare before dropping back into cover or dropping forever. Arthur pushes forward through the gardens, hedges exploding into green confetti around him, statues chipped and shattered, roses shredded under boot and blood. Each man in the gang fights with his own ghosts, but Arthur's burden is different. This is not a robbery to prove Dutch's philosophy, not a petty victory in an ancient plantation feud. This is about family, about the last fragile innocence left in a camp that has seen too many graves. In that storm of gunfire, Jack is more than John's boy. He is the promise that their dreams of freedom are not entirely delusions, that the old ways were dying for a reason and something better might still be born. The push becomes inexorable. Braithwaite men fall among the fountains, on the marble steps, in the smoke-choked doorway. Kerosene splashes, curtains catch, and soon orange tongues of flame begin licking up the walls, turning Catherine's proud house into a funeral pyre. As the gang breaches the manor, stepping into a hallway of gunpowder haze and growing firelight, one truth hangs over the crack of every shot. The age of the Braithwaites ends tonight. But what, exactly, is being born in that fire, and who will walk back out of it? Inside Braithwaite Manor, the illusion of gentility dies fast. Velvet curtains smolder, chandeliers swing in the concussion of gunfire, and the grand staircase becomes a killing ground. Portraits of powdered ancestors stare down through a haze of smoke, the living embodiment of a world that believed its power would last forever, now forced to watch its own extinction. The old ways were dying, and they were dying badly. Each room tells a story of wealth and rot. Fine rugs are soaked in blood, glass cabinets shatter under stray bullets, and gilt-framed landscapes of scarlet meadows crack as flames lick the walls. Servants flee or fall, Braithwaite men fire blindly from doorways, and the gang advances through it all, methodical, furious, almost surgical. This is not a robbery. In the truest sense, it is an execution of a dynasty. At the heart of the house, they find her. Catherine Braithwaite stands in a parlor already filling with smoke, framed by heavy drapes and the faint glow of fire behind her. She does not run. She does not beg. She greets Dutch, Arthur, and John with the cold poise of a queen on a sinking throne, a woman who has lost everything except her pride. For a heartbeat, it is almost quiet. Then the real cruelty begins. John demands Jack. Dutch presses, voice tight, that this is about family, about a child. Catherine only smiles, that ruined aristocrat's smile that has seen wars, slave auctions, and reconstruction, and never once admitted fault. She taunts them, twisting the knife with every word. Jack is gone, she says. Sold, handed over to Angelo Bronte in St. Denis, a crime lord in a city that represents everything Dutch claims to hate about civilization. Here the pattern breaks. For all Dutch's speeches about freedom and philosophy, about not being common criminals, Catherine exposes the gang's helplessness with a single revelation. She would rather consign a boy to a foreign gangster than surrender to outlaws she considers beneath her. To her, Jack is not a child. He is a bargaining chip, a final move in a game she thinks she can still win from the ashes. The reactions define the moment. Dutch trembles with barely contained fury, his dreams and delusions colliding with a reality he cannot control. Arthur is sickened, seeing not just Catherine's monstrosity, but Dutch's failure to protect the one thing that mattered. John is desperation made flesh, a father whose world has just been sold to a stranger. Catherine dies in that room, defiant to the last breath. Whether by bullet or by the fire closing in, her end is the final severing of Braithwaite power. Dutch gives the order, unspoken or explicit, and the gang ensures nothing of this estate's authority survives. They walk out through corridors now roaring with flame, past those watching portraits as they blacken and fall. Outside, Braithwaite Manor is fully engulfed, a roaring inferno against the night sky. The gang rides away with no child saved, only a new enemy named Bronte and a region left in smoking ruins. From its humble beginnings as a plantation empire to this charred skeleton, the manor becomes a story of how a lost soul of the Old South burns, and how Dutch's war with civilization is about to move from the swamps to the city. Because if this is what it takes to get Jack back, what will the gang become in St. Denis? Rhodes wakes up to the smell of wet ash and gunpowder. The war that everyone pretended was over has finally marched straight through the front doors of its finest houses. Braithwaite Manor, once the living embodiment of Old South grandeur, stands as a blackened skeleton over scarlet meadows. Columns that hosted balls and business now hold up nothing but scorched air, while the great staircase curls into itself, charred and broken. The marble floors are buried under soot, shattered glass, and the warped metal of safes and strongboxes that once guarded a dynasty's illusion of security. From its humble beginnings as a plantation empire to this ruin, the estate becomes a story of how the old ways were dying in the truest sense, not in speeches, but in smoke. Across the marshes, Caliga Hall survives, but only just. The house still stands, yet its white paint is stained with smoke, its fields pocked with shell craters and hoof scars, its porches patched where bullets tore through railings and men. Tobacco rows lie trampled, wagons overturned, fences shattered. The gray barns bear the black fingerprints of fire, and the overseer's bell hangs silent, twisted on its frame. The manor is not dead, but maimed, a proud animal staggering after a mauling it did not expect. In Rhodes itself, the main street carries the handwriting of the massacre. Window panes are boarded where glass once gleamed, bullet holes freckle brick and timber, and faded bloodstains cling stubbornly to the planks outside the gunsmith and the sheriff's office. The benches where old men once argued about the war now host whispered conversations about what happens when the men who used to own everything suddenly own nothing. Without Braithwaite gold and gray law, a power vacuum opens across Lemoyne. The sheriff's badge means less with Lee Gray gone, and deputies begin taking orders from whoever can pay in cash rather than family name. Small-time crooks, moonshiners, and roaming bandits drift in, testing fences, shaking down merchants, probing the edges of a town whose keepers have vanished. Northern investors sniff opportunity, wondering who will sell them land, and at what price. now that the old signatures have burned. Ordinary people are torn between relief and dread. Some storekeepers quietly celebrate the fall of the royals, who squeezed every dollar and controlled every wagon that entered Rhodes. Others, especially those who worked the fields or depended on Gray protection, stare at the empty verandas with real fear. Better the devils they knew than no devils at all. At least the Braithwaites and Grays had rules, however cruel. What comes after rules, when only profit and pistols remain? For the von der Linde gang, the moment is both triumph and curse. They have avenged Sean, answered betrayal with fire, and humiliated two houses that once dictated terms to an entire county. Dutch proves his philosophy on southern soil. No king, no lord, no sheriff can stand against a united outlaw family. But the cost is steep. By burning a manor, spilling a sheriff's blood, and turning Rhodes into a battlefield, they have announced themselves to Pinkertons, to railroads, to every quiet office where civilization plots its next move. Anonymity in Lemoyne is gone. The gang's legend grows, and with it, the noose. Dutch does not linger among the ashes. His gaze, always chasing a bigger promise, swings toward the glittering lights on the horizon, St. Denis, and the name Angelo Bronte. If the plantations represent a dying past, the city represents the future, a world of banks, steam, and grand illusions of freedom. Dutch convinces himself that in those streets, among men who wear silk instead of gun belts, the gang's real fortune waits. The ruins of Rhodes still smolder behind them as the caravan rolls on, leaving a vacuum they created and cannot control. The feud is over, but the story of the gang's downfall is only tightening. Because if this is what Dutch unleashes over one kidnapped child and a wounded ego, what will he unleash when the entire machinery of a modern city stands in his way? The ruins of Rhodes are not just physical, they are moral. The feud the gang walks away from leaves a more unsettling question behind. Between the Braithwaites and the Grays, which dynasty of decay truly poisoned this corner of the world? On the surface, the Braithwaites seem obvious. From the very beginning, their fortune is built on slavery, on human beings treated as crop and currency, on a plantation that is the living embodiment of a dead empire. When the old ways were dying after the Civil War, they did not repent. They adapted their cruelty. Their moonshine rings keep poor families drunk and indebted. Their enforcers beat and murder without hesitation, and Catherine Braithwaite rules Scarlet Meadows in the truest sense through fear. Faced with Dutch's betrayal, her first instinct is not to bargain, but to steal a child. Jack's kidnapping is not just revenge. It is a declaration that innocence means nothing against her pride. The Grays, at first, wear cleaner clothes. Caliga Hall looks more orderly. Lee Gray smiles behind his badge, and Rhodes presents itself as a quiet, civilized town. Yet that calm is a performance. Their tobacco operations are rigged through smuggling and tax evasion. Their rivals are harassed under color of law, and the sheriff's office is essentially a family business. Lee does not have to send riders with torches. He has deputies and paperwork. When the time comes, he turns that facade into a firing squad, orchestrating the massacre in Rhodes that cuts down Sean and leaves Arthur and the gang running for their lives. The Braithwaites burn openly. The Grays kill from behind a handshake. Together, they tell a story of two faces of the same rot. One is aristocratic ruin, drunk on its own fated power, clinging to a plantation philosophy that should have died with the Confederacy. The other is polished and respectable, using civilization's tools, courts, badges, contracts to chase the same dreams of dominance and profit. Is Catherine's open venom worse than Lee's courteous betrayal? Or is the more dangerous outlaw the one who writes the laws, sits in the sheriff's chair, and smiles while signing death warrants? This is the pattern Interrupt Dutch never fully understands. From its humble beginnings, his gang defines itself against rich tyrants, against men who own railroads and banks. Yet in Rhodes, the line between outlaw and respectable society blurs until it almost disappears. The Braithwaites and the Grays show that in this world, a murderer can wear a dress of mourning or a star of office, and the blood on their hands looks the same. And as the gang rides toward St. Denis, toward the true machinery of modern power, this lesson will only grow harsher. If this is what decaying plantation royalty can do with a single county, what will an entire city, its politicians, tycoons, and Pinkertons, do to a lost soul chasing freedom at the edge of a dying frontier? That machinery finds its first real test case in the smallest, most vulnerable member of Dutch's family. The feud in Rhodes ends with fire and gunpowder, but its longest shadow falls on a single frightened boy being hauled away in a carriage, torn from the only world he knows. From Braithwaite Manor's smoldering ruins, Jack Marston's path does not lead back to camp or freedom. Catherine Braithwaite has him taken under guard to St. Denis, bundled through swamps and rail yards, a quiet hostage in a world of adults playing at war. In the city, she hands him over as if he were cargo, trading a child's future to Angelo Bronte in exchange for cash, protection, and the favor of a man whose reach extends far beyond Lemoyne's dying plantations. In the truest sense, Jack becomes the currency that buys Catherine one last grasp at relevance. Bronte's mansion in St. Denis stands miles and centuries away from Braithwaite Manor, yet it tells the same story of power built on other people's suffering. Jack is dressed in fine clothes, given toys, fed well, and paraded at dinner as an amusing curiosity. It looks on the surface almost generous, but the velvet is just another set of chains. Bronte calls him the boy, never by name, the living embodiment of a bargaining chip, a reminder that Dutch's gang now dances to a tune played in polished parlors and smoke-filled back rooms. For Jack, the experience is a quiet nightmare. He's not beaten or starved. He is something worse, ignored, managed, kept. Servants usher him from room to room. Strangers speak around him in French and polished English, and the city roars beyond the iron gates. The world was changing, and this child, born into an outlaw camp that promised freedom under the open sky, now stares out at civilization through stained glass and wrought iron, learning that captivity can come wrapped in comfort. Catherine's choice reveals just how well she understands that new world. She does not hide Jack on some backwater farm where Dutch might ride in guns blazing. She delivers him to a man more connected, more ruthless, and more entrenched in modern power than she ever could be. By placing Jack in Bronte's gilded cage, she ensures that the gang's troubles will no longer be confined to Rhodes or Scarlet Meadows. What happens when frontier outlaws collide with a city boss who owns politicians, lawmen, and Pinkertons? For John and Abigail, the emotional toll is immediate and relentless. John, who has spent his life drifting between camps and battlefields, now has to walk marble floors and negotiate with a crime lord who sees his son as leverage, not family. Abigail, who has fought for even a semblance of stability from the very beginning, is forced to endure St. Denis's sneering high society, its judgmental stares and whispered insults, all while knowing her child is only a few streets away and utterly out of reach. Their search through this maze of manners and menace becomes a story of parents learning that Dutch's philosophy, his dream of freedom beyond civilization, has a cost they never truly measured. Because Jack's ordeal is the bill come due for Dutch's gamble in Rhodes. A blood feud treated as a puzzle to solve for profit has uprooted a child's life, turning a campfire tale about family into a lesson in betrayal and delusions. And as Dutch smiles at Bronte's table, pretending to be an equal in this new arena, the question hangs over every toast and every promise. How far will this city's power reach into the gang's soul before it finally breaks? The fire at Braithwaite Manor and the gunfight on the steps of the Rhodes Sheriff's Office feel, in the moment, like endings. But the world was changing, and in Lemoyne the end of one chapter is only the uneasy beginning of another. When the gang rides east to St. Denis, Rhodes is left staring at its own reflection, wondering what is left without its masters. Months pass, then years. The transformation is not sudden, not heroic, not clean. Gray uniforms, once a familiar gray-blue blur on every corner, grow sparse, then rare, then faint memories hanging in a tailor's window. Braithwaite carriages stop rolling through town, their crests no longer flashing in the sun as a reminder of old money and older cruelty. In their place come freight wagons, traveling salesmen, and the occasional hopeful investor, all trying to turn a battlefield back into a business district. From its humble beginnings as a quiet depot in Scarlet Meadows, Rhodes had always lived in someone else's shadow. Now, with Catherine dead and Lee Gray disgraced or gone, the town gropes for a new identity. A mayor speaks of progress. Merchants repaint their signs. The train still comes and goes, but every fresh coat of paint feels in the truest sense like a thin veil over bloodstains. Law, too, tries to reinvent itself. A new sheriff arrives, or sometimes a federal marshal passes through, wearing a badge that is supposed to mean something again. Yet, every handshake in the street carries a question. How long before this one sells the office to the highest bidder as well? The memory of Lee using the jail as an arm of Gray philosophy lingers, a quiet accusation behind every polite word. The badge has been exposed as just another piece of metal that can be bought, traded, or killed for. Rhodes talks. That is what small towns do when the gun's smoke clears. Men at the saloon still whisper about the night the manor burned, swearing they saw figures riding through the flames, or heard Catherine's voice cursing the world. Women at the general store lower their voices when they mention the day Sean died, turning a street ambush into a cautionary tale for children who run too far from home. Over time, these moments become legend, a story of a laughing Irish outlaw cut down in his prime, a proud house swallowed by its own sins. In the vacuum, lesser predators move in. Small-time rustlers test the fences around Scarlet Meadows. Moonshiners who once answered to the Braithwaites now answer to no one, or to whatever thug can shout the loudest. A pair of desperate men might try to rob each other behind the train station, only realizing the irony when both draw empty guns. Removing two tyrants does not summon justice from the ether. It simply opens the board for new players, new bargains, new betrayals. Rhodes endures, but it is haunted. Not by ghosts in the supernatural sense, but by choices, by loyalties traded, and lives discarded. The town stands as the living embodiment of a dying order, a place where the old ways were dying yet refused to stay buried. Every passing train, every creaking sign, every wary glance between stranger and lawman carries the same unspoken truth. This quiet little crossroads has already been to war once, and the echoes of that war are not done with it yet. Rhodes bears the scars of that war, but out in the fields, the war never truly ends. It only changes uniforms. Braithwaite Manor lies in blackened ruin, a charred monument to arrogance and decay, but across the bayou, Caliga Hall still stands, wounded yet unbroken, its columns cracked, its windows shattered, its pride reduced but not erased. The house survives, and so does the work. From its humble beginnings as a slave plantation to its later life as a tobacco empire, Caliga Hall was always less a home and more a machine. After the shootouts, after Tavish Gray falls, and Lee Gray's authority collapses, the player can still ride past those long rows of tobacco and see laborers bent to the task, overseers watching from horseback, wagons hauling bales toward the rail line. Leadership has changed, money has changed, but the rhythm of exploitation remains the same. There are hints that the Gray name no longer carries the same open weight. The sheriff's office no longer functions as a family business, and the surviving Grays are conspicuously absent from Rhodes's public stage. Yet the tobacco operation continues in the truest sense, as if the land itself demands it. Guards still patrol the perimeter. Hired guns still shout orders. The fields still burn at night in controlled fires to cure the leaves, a ritual older than the feud that nearly destroyed the family who owned them. So what happened to the Grays who lived through the chaos? The game never hands over a neat ledger, but it whispers possibilities. Some likely fled Lemoyne entirely, taking what remained of their fortune west or into the new corporate south. Others seem to have melted quietly into the background, their influence laundered through intermediaries, merchants, and new foremen who answer to unseen partners. A Gray need not stand on the porch of Caliga Hall to profit from what grows in its soil. Occasional conversations around Rhodes hint at new management and outside investors, the faceless capital of a civilization that has learned to hide its cruelty behind paperwork instead of whips. That is the pattern interrupt. The feud ends, the families fall, yet the system becomes more invisible, not less. The world was changing, but the money still flowed in the same direction. Through it all, the land endures. These are fields once worked by enslaved people, then by sharecroppers and indebted hands, now by hired laborers whose freedom is mostly theoretical. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is written into every furrow. The old ways were dying, but their shadow stretches across every row of tobacco, every coughing worker, every silent sagging veranda. In the end, Caliga Hall becomes a ghost of its former self, a plantation kingdom without a visible king. The crowns have been knocked off, yet the engine keeps grinding. The house stands, half empty, the living embodiment of a lost soul of the Old South that refuses to admit it is dead. And somewhere beyond those fields, new powers are already circling, ready to claim what the Grays could not keep. But ruins do not tell the whole story. A burned manor and a hollowed-out hall are dramatic, visible endings, yet the true aftermath of the Braithwaite, Gray feud lives in the people who are never named. The camera lingers on Catherine, on Lee, on Beau and Penelope, but the world of Lemoyne quietly hints at something larger. Cousins, in-laws, nephews sent away to school, widowed aunts in townhouses, all bound to these houses by blood and shame. From the very beginning, this was not just a story of two tyrants ruling over a handful of servants. It was a small aristocracy, a web of obligation and entitlement stretching from Rhodes to Saint Denis. If Catherine had sons and daughters, then those sons and daughters had children. If the Grays had brothers and uncles, then somewhere there are people who share their name, their money once, and their philosophy. Not everyone died in a field or a burning parlor. Some simply were not home that night. Imagine A minor Braithwaite heir returning from St. Denis or even overseas, expecting the old plantation welcome, and finding only ashes and half-drunk laborers picking over what remains. The title is meaningless now, the family wealth vaporized, the servants gone. What does that heir do? Cling to a ruined name, marching into Rhodes demanding deference that no one can afford to give, or vanish into another state, cutting the Braithwaite from the front door and from the introduction? Freedom, in the truest sense, might mean abandoning the only identity ever known. For a lesser Gray, the fall is quieter but just as brutal. Caliga Hall still stands, but the income is thin, the law is no longer a private tool, and the sheriff's badge no longer guarantees immunity. A second son or distant cousin, raised on tales of gallant riders and noble tobacco, now faces a world where tobacco is just a commodity and the family crest frightens more bankers than bandits. Some would double down, turning to smuggling and desperate outlaw schemes. Others would take the humiliating path into town, hat in hand, begging the very merchants their fathers once bullied. Yet not all survivors stay in the mud of Scarlet Meadows. The world was changing, and St. Denis offered a different kind of plantation. Offices, salons, universities. A Braithwaite grandson with a decent education could step into a clerkship. A Gray niece might marry into an old Creole family, each quietly burying the past. They would host dinners, quote French poetry, speak of the war in vague terms, and never mention moonshine stills or lynching trees. In drawing rooms lit by electric lamps, the old ways were dying, but their ghosts still chose the wine. And what of their children, born in city apartments or modest farmhouses, raised on fading stories of honor and betrayal? The land is gone, the slaves are gone, the titles are gone, yet the resentment remains. A grandfather mutters about what the Braithwaites did, or how the Grays were robbed, and a new generation learns to hate people they have never met over fields they have never seen. The feud survives, not as open gunfire, but as a quiet prejudice, a bitter joke, a refusal to do business with that family. This is how such a story endures. The main houses fall in fire and gunsmoke, yet the culture that built them does not vanish. It disperses. It adapts. It hides in plain sight, in St. Denis parlors, in Rhodes back rooms, in the hearts of descendants who barely know why they feel wronged, only that civilization betrayed them. And somewhere out there, a Braithwaite and a Gray may one day sit across a table in ignorance, two lost souls discussing business, never realizing that their ancestors once killed for the ground beneath their feet. But not every descendant is doomed to repeat the past. In the ashes of Braithwaite Manor and the hollowed halls of Caliga Hall, one small train pulling out of Rhodes carries a different legacy. Two frightened aristocrats with a suitcase, a handful of dollars, and a decision to be more than their last names. That platform farewell is a story of endings and beginnings, of bloodlines and broken chains. Beau Gray, the nervous idealist who could barely stand up to his uncle, and Penelope Braithwaite, the sharp-tongued abolitionist trapped in a decaying dynasty, step onto that train as outlaws in the truest sense. Not outlaws to the state, but to their own family's philosophy. Everything behind them screams duty, loyalty, revenge. Everything ahead is uncertainty. They go anyway. From the very beginning, the game frames their escape not as a fantasy, but as a fragile possibility. Penelope's letters, written in a tone that mixes fear with stubborn hope, hint that they do find some foothold beyond Lemoyne. She speaks of cities where no one knows the Braithwaite name, of cheap rooms and cheaper meals, of Beau trying to find honest work in a world that does not care about ruined Southern royalty. The details are sparse, but the implication is clear. They survive long enough to start building something that belongs to them. In that sense, their romance is more than a balcony flirtation in a dying plantation town. It is an act of rebellion against both houses, against the old ways that were dying yet refused to admit it. A Gray loving a Braithwaite is scandalous, but what truly terrifies their elders is what that love represents. A rejection of racism, of classism, of the belief that civilization must rest on ownership and cruelty to endure. Beau does not just defy Tavish Gray. He abandons the entire idea that his blood entitles him to command. Penelope does not simply flee Catherine. She walks away from a world built on chained labor and inherited sin. Beyond Lemoyne, their challenges would only multiply. What happens when two people raised on servants and estates discover no one cares who their grandfather was? They would meet Northerners who despise their accent, Southerners who despise their politics, and employers who see them as soft, useless remnants of a defeated class. Money would run thin, pride would be tested. Without the Braithwaite or Gray name, they must decide who they are when no one is watching. Yet that is precisely why their thread in this larger saga matters. Amid burned fields, dead sheriffs, and a gang sliding toward disaster, Bo and Penelope stand as the living embodiment of a different choice. From its humble beginnings on that Rhodes platform, their union suggests that individuals can sometimes step outside the story written for them, even if the world was changing far too slowly around them. Their love does not fix Lemoyne. It does not resurrect the dead. But somewhere beyond those swamps, two former heirs are learning to be human before they are Braithwaite or Gray. And as the Van der Linde gang rides on toward St. Denis, toward banks and betrayals, the question lingers. In a world built on cycles of hatred, who else will dare to run for that train? But as Bo and Penelope flee the ruins of their inheritance, another figure rides away from Rhodes, convinced he has mastered the game. Dutch van der Linde leaves Lemoyne believing the feud proved his philosophy, when in truth it exposed his deepest weakness. From the very beginning of the Rhodes chapter, Dutch treats the Braithwaite, Gray conflict as a puzzle to be solved, not a wound that has bled for generations. Two ancient houses, a town bought and paid for, a sheriff in one family's pocket and moonshine in the other's fields. To Dutch, it is all opportunity. He decides to play both sides, sending Arthur and the others to work for Catherine Braithwaite and for Sheriff Lee Gray, confident that charm, improvisation, and a few clever betrayals can outthink centuries of hatred. In his mind, he is the living embodiment of the clever outlaw outwitting a rotten civilization. This is overconfidence in the truest sense. Dutch believes that because he can read a room, flatter a matriarch, or needle a cowardly sheriff, he can also bend entrenched power structures to his will. He underestimates how deep the feud runs, how much blood and pride are already sunk into those plantations. What are generations of war, he seems to think, next to his own brilliance? To justify the risk, Dutch leans on moral rationalization. Robbing slavers, corrupt planters, and their bought lawmen feels righteous. On paper, it is a story of freedom against a decaying aristocracy. He tells the gang that stealing Braithwaite gold and Gray money is justice, that turning their own feud against them is almost charity. Yet his schemes drag the camp into local politics they barely understand, and the cost lands on the smallest shoulders. Jack Marston is taken from camp because Dutch walked the gang straight into the Braithwaite's parlor and made them feel humiliated. How righteous does the philosophy sound when a child is screaming from the back of a carriage? Hosea and Arthur sense the danger early. Hosea's instinct is to avoid entanglements with powerful families. Arthur's journal drips with doubt about Dutch's growing taste for theatrics over caution. Their warnings, spoken quietly around campfires and in hushed conversations, are brushed aside. Dutch increasingly hears only what confirms his plans and dismisses what challenges them. That selective listening, that confirmation bias, will later doom the gang in St. Denis and Beaver Hollow, but Rhodes is where the pattern becomes undeniable. The Rhodes arc marks a turning point in Dutch's relationship with reality. Each small success, a shipment stolen, a lawman fooled, a payoff earned, is treated as proof that his instincts are not just good, but infallible. Cleverness blurs into a sense of invincibility. When the Grays massacre Sean in the street and the Braithwaites burn their own manor around Jack's absence, Dutch does not truly reassess. He doubles down. In that sense, the feud is a dress rehearsal for every catastrophe to come. A smaller stage, a tighter cast, but the same fatal flaws already on display for anyone willing to look past the speeches. The old ways were dying, the world was changing, and Dutch van der Linde could no longer tell the difference between his dreams and his delusions. Rhodes is where those delusions stop being abstract. It is where Arthur Morgan watches Dutch's grand philosophy collide with the quiet, methodical cruelty of respectable people, and realizes that civilization can be every bit as vicious as the outlaw trail. At the very beginning of the Rhodes chapter, Arthur treats it as just another town, just another angle. Dutch talks about opportunity, Hosea talks about caution, and Arthur rides in with the weary pragmatism of a man who has heard a lot of speeches and seen a lot of blood. The Braithwaites and Grays are marks to be worked, not monsters to be slain. If the gang can play both sides, skim some money and move on, that is enough. In his journal, he frames it as business. Dutch thinks there is good money here, the families are idiots, and the plan is to use them, not get used. But Rhodes refuses to stay clean. The ambush on the town square, when the Grays lure the gang into a trap and Sean is shot through the head mid-sentence, shatters the illusion that this feud is just colorful local drama. One second, Sean is laughing, the living embodiment of the gang's rough camaraderie. The next, he is dead on the dirt while Sheriff Lee Gray stands over the scene in his polished badge and fine coat. Arthur sees a friend murdered not by a bandit or a rival outlaw, but by lawmen in uniform working for a plantation dynasty. What is the difference, really, between a sheriff's office and a gang hideout when both exist to protect a family's power? Then Jack is taken. Catherine Braithwaite's genteel accent and decaying manor house cannot disguise what she is in the truest sense. A kidnapper willing to barter a child's life to hurt Dutch and enrich herself through her shadow dealings with Angelo Bronte. Arthur rides through the burning Braithwaite manor, flames licking the columns of a house built on slavery and moonshine, and the line between good society and outlaw life melts in the heat. From its humble beginnings, the feud might have been about old insults and ancient pride, but in Arthur's eyes it has become a story of family destroyed, of innocence stolen, of loyalty twisted into a weapon. In his journal after Sean's death and Jack's return, Arthur's tone shifts. He wonders if Dutch is fighting civilization or chasing his own reflection. Dutch rails against men like Lee Gray and Catherine Braithwaite as parasites, yet he uses the gang in the same way, expendable pieces in a private war. Is this still a struggle between freedom and civilization, or just one more contest of egos dressed up as philosophy? The old ways were dying, the world was changing, and Arthur begins to suspect Dutch is not a prophet at all, only another ambitious man who cannot let go. Rhodes does not complete Arthur's transformation, but it plants the seeds. Watching respectable families burn, watching Dutch smile through catastrophe, Arthur starts to see that the real enemy may not be a single town or family, but the entire system of power that turns every man into a potential lost soul. Those doubts will follow him to St. Denis, to Guarma, and beyond, growing louder each time Dutch asks for one more sacrifice. For Arthur, Rhodes is where doubt begins to whisper. For John Marston, it is where doubt starts to scream. In the truest sense, the feud between Braithwaites and Grays does not just claim bodies in the street. It reaches into his tent, into his bedroll, and tears at the fragile idea of family he is trying to hold together. From the very beginning of the Rhodes chapter, John's place in the gang is precarious. He has only recently crawled back from Blackwater disgrace, from being left behind and half believed dead, and some still see him as Dutch's wayward son who ran off and tried to go straight. He spends long stretches away, scouting with Abigail, working odd robberies, never quite at the center of Dutch's grand philosophy the way Arthur is. An outlaw, a father, a man trying to be both in a world that punishes each role through the other. Around the campfire at Clemens Point, there is a pattern. John talks about providing for Jack, about needing real money and some measure of safety, and Dutch answers with speeches about freedom, about civilization closing in, about one last score. It is a story of clashing priorities. Dutch chasing an idealistic dream of resistance, John watching his son play in the dirt, measuring every plan against that small, fragile life. How long before those two visions collide? When Jack is taken, the collision arrives in a single brutal moment. The Braithwaite's carriage vanishes down the lane, the gang gives chase too late, and John's world narrows to one thought. He failed. He was not there. He did not protect his boy. His rage at Catherine Braithwaite is immediate and volcanic, but underneath it runs another current, colder and more dangerous. Dutch put them in Rhodes. Dutch pushed the feud. Dutch sent Jack to town as part of the performance of respectability. Who really put the child in harm's way? In the aftermath, John's conversations with Dutch carry a new edge. He challenges the wisdom of dealing with these old families, questions why every plan seems to dangle the gang's loved ones over the fire. Dutch answers with rhetoric about necessary risks, about enemies on every side, about destiny. John hears excuses. The ideological split that will one day define Red Dead Redemption does not begin with Blackwater or Beecher's Hope. It begins on those Lemoyne plantations, with a father asking why his son was treated as a pawn. Even when Jack is rescued from Angelo Bronte and returned, the damage is done. John has seen the cost of Dutch's games, not in abstract principles, but in a terrified child's eyes. The old ways were dying, the world was changing, and John understands that the gang's dream of freedom is now the living embodiment of a trap. If staying with Dutch means gambling Jack's life again, what choice is there but betrayal of the gang or betrayal of his own blood? From its humble beginnings, John's bond with Dutch was built on admiration and need. Rhodes twists that bond into obligation and resentment. The man standing on the banks at Blackwater, the rancher hammering nails at Beecher's Hope, is shaped by this moment. The near loss of his son, the realization that loyalty to Dutch is loyalty to a story that will devour his family. And as the gang rides south towards St. Denis, John carries a quiet decision that Dutch has not yet heard, a decision that will one day turn gun barrels inward. John's quiet decision to put his family above Dutch's dreams leads the gang into the one place where that choice becomes unbearably complicated. Rhodes, a town where criminals wear badges and aristocrats dress their violence in silk. On the surface, the Braithwaites and the Grays are everything Dutch claims to be fighting. Old money, old names, old power. Yet the moment the Van der Linde gang arrives, the illusion begins to crack. Dutch and his people are branded outlaws in the truest sense, hunted and named as enemies of civilization. The Braithwaites and the Grays, by contrast, host garden parties, drink imported wine, and reminisce about the very beginning of their plantations, as if their fortunes simply grew out of the soil. But the game makes the comparison unavoidable. Both families run illegal empires, Braithwaite moonshine flowing through the swamps, Gray tobacco and smuggling protected by a corrupted sheriff's office. All three factions live outside the spirit of the law. Only the branding is different. This is a story of masks. Dutch preaches a ragged philosophy of freedom, robbery is rebellion against a rigged world. Catherine Braithwaite and Sheriff Lee Gray preach tradition, order, and respectability, while quietly turning Rhodes into a company town. The sheriff's star, the manor's white columns, the polished pistols on a lawman's hip, these become props in a theater where some crimes are condemned and others are blessed. Is a moonshine ring really less civilized than a sheriff using his office as a family business? The game answers through fire and ruins. When Braithwaite Manor goes up in flames, the burning plantation is more than revenge for Jack's kidnapping. It is the living embodiment of a deeper critique, that America's wealth was built on human misery, then washed clean through law, lineage, and myth. The same is true of Hall's fields, patrolled by overseers and enforcers under the protection of the badge. The old ways were dying, but the embers still burn in Rhodes. Throughout this arc, the world itself comments on the hypocrisy. Gang members mutter that Lemoyne's respectable folk are worse than bandits. NPCs in town whisper about the feud's long, ugly history while still tipping their hats to the Grays. Even Beau and Penelope, trapped between families, see that the war around them is less about honor and more about pride, profit, and fear of losing power. A pattern interrupt arrives in the simplest form. A quiet street, a friendly sheriff, an invitation to work. Then the trap is sprung, and Sean dies in a hail of bullets delivered by men who call themselves the law. In Rhodes, the line between outlaw and aristocrat blurs until it almost disappears. By the time both houses stand ruined, the question lingers over every smoking field and shattered column. In this collapsing world of progress and civilization, who were the real villains of Red Dead Redemption 2? That question does not stay in Rhodes. It follows John Marston all the way into Red Dead Redemption, turning every polite smile from a politician or government agent into an echo of Lee Gray's handshake and Catherine Braithwaite's brittle courtesy. From the very beginning in Lemoyne, John learns that men in fine suits and women in decaying mansions can be far more dangerous than any outlaw with a gun. Lee Gray plays sheriff, but he is the living embodiment of rigged law, using a badge to protect his family's tobacco empire. Catherine plays grieving matriarch, but she funds moonshine and kidnapping from behind lace curtains. Years later, when Edgar Ross and his fellow agents talk about civilization, order, and the greater good, John has already seen what those words can hide. How different are Ross's threats against John's family from Catherine's decision to steal Jack, or Lee's decision to turn Rhodes into an ambush in a graveyard? The fall of the Braithwaites and the Grays is not an isolated catastrophe. It is a pattern. A story of families that mistake power for permanence, of gangs that confuse dreams with destiny, of old houses and outlaw camps that burn all the same. The plantation aristocracy of Lemoyne, the ranchers and rustlers of New Austin, the Van der Linde gang itself, each believes it can bend the world through will alone. Each is proven wrong at gunpoint. In Red Dead Redemption, the remnants of that pattern are everywhere. The McFarlanes struggle to hold a respectable ranch together as rustlers close in. The Escuela and DeSanta intrigues in Mexico echo the same dance of elites using hired guns to crush rivals. Dutch's final gang in West Elizabeth preys on trains and oil interests, but ends surrounded by the very civilization he always claimed to resist. The old ways were dying, but not peacefully. They are dragged down, kicking and screaming, taking anyone nearby with them. For Jack Marston, Rhodes is not a political lesson. It is a childhood nightmare. He watches the gang play family on the Braithwaite lawn, then wakes to find himself stolen, traded, and traumatized between Rhodes and St. Denis. He sees Dutch's philosophy turn from idealistic speeches into desperate violence, without understanding why. By the time he is the quiet, bookish young man at Beecher's Hope, his love of stories and distance from bloodshed are not accidents. They are scars. He retreats into books because the real world has already shown him too much. Even the land remembers. New Austin's decayed homesteads, burned-out ranches, and lonely graves mirror the charred ruins of Braithwaite Manor. Corrupt officials in Blackwater and Blackwater's own whispered fairy disaster reflect Rhodes's smiling lawmen and hidden massacres. From its humble beginnings in backroom deals and whispered feuds to federal agents pulling strings, the same tragedy unfolds. Freedom promised, family endangered, progress weaponized. In the truest sense, Rhodes is only one chapter in a larger American tragedy that stretches across both games. Plantation aristocracy and outlaw freedom die together, replaced not by justice, but by a colder, more efficient civilization. The world was changing. The question is whether anyone truly escaped the fire. If Rhodes is a microcosm of a dying order, then the next question almost asks itself, what if Dutch had simply ridden past? What if the Van der Linde gang had treated Scarlet Meadows not as a battlefield, but as a brief shelter on the road from one disaster to the next? From its humble beginnings, the gang survived by slipping into the cracks of civilization, not by standing at the center of its oldest feuds. In an alternate story of Rhodes, Shady Belle is still taken. The camp is still set among the cypress and the fog, but Dutch keeps his head down. The Braithwaites remain distant shapes on the horizon. The Grays no more than a name on a tobacco crate, and the gang uses the town for what it is in the truest sense, a quiet resupply point on the edge of a crumbling aristocracy. In this version, Arthur and the others move through Rhodes' shadows. They buy ammunition, sell pelts, listen more than they speak. Jobs are smaller, pettier, and safer. Stagecoaches on back roads, river boats on dark stretches of the Kamasa, moonshine runs that do not carry a family's honor on their backs. Sean never rides into town under the Grays' watchful eyes. Jack plays on the porch of Shady Belle without ever seeing the white pillars of Braithwaite Manor. But would Rhodes itself be spared? Probably not. The feud between Braithwaite and Gray is the living embodiment of Lemoyne's past. Slaveholding wealth shattered by the Civil War, pride curdled into paranoia, fortunes propped up by moonshine and smuggling. Dutch accelerates the fire, but the tinder's already there. Catherine Braithwaite would still cling to her decaying empire. Sheriff Lee Gray would still bend the badge toward his family's debts, and Beau and Penelope would still dream of a world where their love is not a crime against blood. Without the gang's interference, the ambush on the Rhodes Street might never happen, but some other spark would. A bad harvest, a crooked shipment, a drunken insult at the saloon. The old ways were dying, and men like Tavish Gray and Catherine were not built to go quietly. Dutch does not create their hatred, he merely weaponizes it. Yet if he had refused that temptation, another consequence follows. No Rhodes entanglement means no grand gesture to impress Angelo Bronte. No need to prove to a St. Denis crime lord that the Van der Linde gang can topple dynasties on command. Dutch's overreach into the city's marble halls might have been delayed. His reckless alliance with Bronte postponed by months. The gang could have lingered in the swamps, pulling smaller scores, buying time. But time is not the same as salvation. Dutch's philosophy is already cracking after Blackwater. His pride is already wounded, his paranoia already growing. Even without Rhodes, he is still drawn toward spectacle, toward enemies he can blame for a world that no longer fits his dreams of freedom. The world was changing, and Dutch was determined to prove that it was wrong. In this alternate path, the gang perhaps survives a season longer, loses one or two fewer souls, leaves Rhodes as a ghost town instead of a graveyard. Yet the larger forces remain: industrial capital in St. Denis, Pinkertons on the rails, an America that has no patience left for outlaw families. Men like Dutch and families like the Braithwaites and Grays are already on a collision course with history itself. The only real question is not whether the crash happens, but where the first fractures appear, and that question leads straight to St. Denis, to Angelo Bronte, and to a plan so grand it can only end in catastrophe. For the Braithwaites and the Grays, the crash with history does not begin with Dutch van der Linde. It begins long before, in the soil of Lemoyne itself. From its humble beginnings, this is a story of land, labor, and power, dressed up as romance and insult, a plantation war that learned to call itself a family feud. On the surface, the quarrel looks personal. Old names spat as curses, wagons burned, sons and cousins gunned down on country roads. Yet every detail in Rhodes hints at something colder. These are neighboring dynasties whose fortunes were built on enslaved labor, whose fields once stretched unbroken across Scarlet Meadows. When the Civil War ended and emancipation shattered their economy, both houses reached for the same shrinking resources: tenant farmers, sharecroppers, convict labor, and the political machinery that could still be bent to their will. Land is the first battlefield. The Braithwaites cling to their decaying manor and moonshine operations, turning the swamps into an illegal distillery network to keep the taxes and the banks at bay. The Grays fortify Caliga Hall with tobacco and law badges, using Sheriff Lee Gray to turn the town's jail, courts, and roads into extensions of their estate. Honor becomes a convenient word for what is, in the truest sense, a fight over who gets to own the future of Lemoyne. Both families speak in the language of insult and wounded pride. Catherine Braithwaite hisses about slights that must be avenged. Tavish Gray rants about disrespect and loyalty. Yet when the smoke clears, what do their grand speeches protect? Wagon routes, crop contracts, smuggling corridors, and the right to decide who in Rhodes lives as a tenant and who dares dream of freedom. The rhetoric of civilization and proper breeding hides a simple truth. They are battling over revenue streams. Their nostalgia gives them away. Catherine talks about the good old days. Tavish about proper order, as if time itself has betrayed them. The world was changing and the old ways were dying, but these aging patriarchs and matriarchs cling to a philosophy that insists their class is the living embodiment of natural rule. Their fear is not just of northern bankers or federal marshals. It is of a world where their titles mean nothing, their portraits gather dust, and their children must live without inherited crowns. The younger generation sees the cracks. Beau Gray and Penelope Braithwaite stand amid the ruins of this aristocracy and recognize the trap. They are asked to sacrifice love, future, even physical safety, not for noble principle, but to defend elders who are hoarding pride and property. Beau is mocked as weak, Penelope dismissed as hysterical, yet they understand what their grandparents refused to admit. This is a dying order demanding fresh blood. In that light, the Braithwaite-Gray feud is best understood as a class war turned inward, a cannibalism of a fading elite. Instead of accepting a more equal, uncertain future, they turn their guns on each other, and later on Dutch's gang, in a desperate attempt to prove they still matter. The tragedy is that by the time the outlaws arrive, the aristocrats have already done most of the destroying themselves. The gang will only light the final match. The gang will only light the final match. The real fire has been smoldering in Lemoyne for decades, and Rhodes is where it burns through the surface. In the truest sense, this quiet little town is a story of a whole region trying to pretend the war never ended. Across Red Dead Redemption 2's world, each territory marks a different stage of America's transformation. New Hanover is wide and rugged, still clinging to the dream of open range and outlaw freedom. West Elizabeth, with Blackwater and the Great Plains, stands on the edge between wilderness and order, a frontier being surveyed, fenced, and bought. St. Denis is the future made concrete. Factories, electric lights, immigrant labor, and capital flowing faster than any horse. But Lemoyne, and especially Rhodes, is something else entirely. It is the past, refusing to leave. From its humble beginnings as a plantation hub, Rhodes became the living embodiment of the Old South's promise and its poison. The Braithwaites and the Grays are not just two rich families, they are two survival strategies for a defeated aristocracy. Catherine Braithwaite presides over a rotting manor and a moonshine empire, clinging to decayed grandeur and outright crime, turning former slave fields into contraband swamps. Across the bayou, Tavish and Lee Gray wrap their operations in badges and ledgers, using the sheriff's office and tobacco contracts to launder the same old power through law and business. Both houses talk of honor, family, and loyalty. Both are built on exploitation. One hides in the shadows, one in the courthouse. That binary contrast is the philosophy of Lemoyne in miniature. Adapt the costume, never the hierarchy. The world was changing, but the old ways were dying slowly, and these people were determined to die with them rather than change. The game fills Rhodes with details that make that refusal palpable. Confederate flags hang from porches. Veterans in tattered gray uniforms linger on street corners, telling stories of the war as if it ended last week. A monument to Lemoyne's dead stands near the tracks, half ignored, half revered. Even the casual conversations in the saloon circle back to the occupation, to Reconstruction, to federal troops and lost plantations. This is a town stuck between defeat and denial. A lost soul of a place, wandering the ruins of its own mythology. When the Braithwaite Manor burns and Caliga Hall is shattered, the destruction feels inevitable. Dutch and his gang deliver the final blow, but history did most of the work. The mansions fall, yet the economic and racial structures that built them do not vanish. They migrate into St. Denis boardrooms, into railroad charters, into new forms of civilization that look modern while carrying the same old rot. That is why the Braithwaite-Gray feud matters so much. It is not just a backdrop for a few missions, but a story of a region devouring itself as progress closes in. To understand their war is to see Lemoyne as a living, dying character in America's larger tale, and to sense that the flames rising over Rhodes are only the beginning. But those flames do not only consume mansions and family names, they burn through kitchens, slave quarters turned sharecropper shacks, and the fragile routines of people whose stories never reach the title cards. From the very beginning, Braithwaite Manor and Caliga Hall are presented as grand estates, the living embodiment of a dying aristocracy. Yet listen closely in the fields and side rooms, and another world emerges. Black laborers move through tobacco rows and moonshine sheds. Servants drift through corridors with lowered eyes. Tenant farmers haggle at the edges of the property. Their days are ordered by Braithwaite and Gray commands, but their fears and hopes belong to a different story entirely. Their dialogue is quiet, almost easy to miss. A worker mutters about wages never paid. A maid hints that Catherine Braithwaite's temper is not just an old woman's quirk, but a threat that shapes every hour of her life. A stable hand at Caliga Hall talks about the Gray's dealings with lawmen and smugglers, aware that any mistake will cost him more than it costs his employers. In those small lines, the long shadow of slavery lingers, a reminder that the old ways were dying, but the philosophy of ownership and control had simply changed its clothes. There are hints of resistance as well, subtle and dangerous. A servant who looks the other way when an outlaw trespasses. A field hand who shares a rumor that undermines a master's authority. These are not grand speeches or cinematic betrayals. They are survival choices, made by people who understand that open defiance in Lemoyne can end in a ditch. Who really pays when plantation royalty decide to feud? When Braithwaite Manor finally goes up in flames, the camera lingers on the family, not the staff. Yet for every screaming heir, there are cooks, cleaners, and farmhands suddenly without wages, food, or shelter. Some flee into the night, clutching what little they own. Others stay on the land, working charred fields for whoever claims them next. For a few, the destruction might feel, in the truest sense, like a door cracking open, a chance for freedom from its humble beginnings, even if stepping through that door could mean starvation. Caliga Hall's suffering is slower, but the cost is just as real. Raids, shootouts, and collapsing Gray power turn the estate into a battlefield. Tenants who once answered to Lee Gray's deputies now face roving gangs, taxmen, and Pinkertons. The world was changing, yet for those caught between outlaw violence and collapsing plantation rule, it changes into something harsher, not kinder. That absence is not an accident. The game's focus on outlaws and aristocrats mirrors a real history in which black laborers and poor tenants were pushed to the margins of the official record. Their names are rarely spoken, their graves often unmarked. But their brief appearances invite a harder question. Whose blood actually waters these fields of tobacco and pride? In the end, the Braithwaite Gray feud is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, measured not only in dead sons and ruined houses, but in the shattered lives of those who never chose a side. The body count stretches far beyond the men with surnames carved into stone. It runs through every anonymous worker forced to rebuild, relocate, or disappear, long after the last mansion ember fades. In the years that follow, the Braithwaite Gray feud stops being a fresh wound and starts becoming something else. It becomes a story of a thing half remembered and half invented, traded over whiskey glasses and between rocking chairs as the sun goes down over scarlet meadows. Facts do not disappear, they erode. Everyone in Rhodes remembers the day the streets ran red, the night the manor burned, the way Caliga Hall filled with gun smoke and shouting. But memory bends under the weight of fear, pride, and the need to make sense of senseless ruin. So the massacre in the square turns into a tale of ghostly outlaws who appeared from nowhere and vanished into the bayou. The burning of Braithwaite Manor becomes a cursed reckoning, a fire that some swear burned blue, as if hell itself had come to collect a debt. In one version, told by men who miss the old order, the von der Linde gang are demons. Foreigners, radicals, the living embodiment of everything wrong with a world where plantation gates no longer guarantee safety. Dutch becomes a devil with a silver tongue, Arthur a faceless butcher, the whole gang an invading army that toppled noble houses out of envy for their breeding and land. It is a story that pretends those houses were not already rotting from the inside. In another version, whispered by field hands and small farmers on the fringes of civilization, the gang are avenging angels. Not saints, never that, but rough spirits sent to punish wicked lords clinging to a dead philosophy. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the fire at Braithwaite Manor is remembered as the moment the past finally screamed. In those retellings, Catherine is a tyrant brought low, the Greys are collaborators in uniform, and the outlaws are a storm that cleared the air, even if it left nothing but ash. Somewhere in between, Beau and Penelope drift in and out of the narrative. To the romantic, their love is from its humble beginnings a tragic ballad. Two idealistic hearts caught between loyalty to family and a fragile dream of freedom, running away under gunfire while their surnames burn behind them. To the bitter, they are foolish children who fled responsibility, proof that the last heirs of Lemoyne aristocracy abandoned their posts the moment things grew hard. Over time, even their names blur, reduced to that Braithwaite girl and that Gray boy who ran off on a wagon one bloody afternoon. This is myth-making in the truest sense, a process not so different from the way players speak of Red Dead Redemption 2 itself. Missions become legends retold in fragments: the ambush in Rhodes, the charge up the manor steps, the moment Jack is found by the lake. Certain images grow larger with each telling, others fall away, until a complex web of dreams and delusions is remembered as a handful of scenes burned into shared memory. In time, the ledgers vanish, the grave markers sink, and the legal titles pass to distant men who never smelled Lemoyne mud. The names Braithwaite and Gray begin to fade from common speech. But the phrase, "the night the manor burned," endures, a warning, a campfire chill, a reminder that even the grandest house can go up in smoke. And somewhere beyond Rhodes, another legend is already forming, ready to crash into what little piece Lemoyne has left. The ruins of Braithwaite Manor and the hollowed halls of Caliga Hall leave behind more than ash and empty rooms. They leave behind questions. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is scattered across Lemoyne in fragments that demand to be read, overheard, and pieced together. From the very beginning, the feud is not laid out in a single cutscene or neat exposition. It has to be reconstructed from mission dialogue in Rhodes, from ambient conversations on porches and in saloons, from letters tucked into desks and dressers, from environmental scars on the land, and from the way NPCs flinch or sneer when certain names are spoken before and after the bloodletting. A half-drunk Gray at the saloon mutters about old wrongs while a Braithwaite hand curses tobacco tyrants, and together those stray lines build a shared, poisonous history. The game becomes, in the truest sense, an archive. Papers in Braithwaite Manor hint at slaveholding wealth, failed business ventures, and desperate moonshine schemes. Ledger books in Caliga Hall record tobacco shipments and quiet bribes to Sheriff Lee Gray, turning the Rhodes Law Office into the living embodiment of family power masquerading as civilization. Even the layout of the properties tells a story. Grand drives, crumbling slave quarters, overgrown fields that whisper that the world was changing and the old ways were dying long before Dutch ever rode into town. Yet for all this detail, there are deliberate silences. No character stands in the town square to declare the exact moment the feud began. No omniscient narrator lists every casualty, every duel in the Bayou fog. Some Braithwaites simply vanish from the record. Certain Grays are mentioned once and never named again. Is that negligence or design? The gaps force the player into the role of historian, weighing testimony, timing, and tone. Fan communities seize on those gaps. Timelines are drafted, mission orders compared, throwaway lines from Rhodes's townsfolk cross-referenced with letters signed by Catherine B. or T. Gray. One camp argues that a land dispute after the Civil War lit the fuse. Another insists that an earlier betrayal, buried even deeper in family memory, must have started it. Out of this debate, cohesive narratives emerge, from its humble beginnings in antebellum arrogance to its fiery conclusion in 1899. Certain subtle discoveries can shift the entire philosophy of the feud. A note in Braithwaite Manor revealing Catherine's financial desperation reframes her not just as a cruel matriarch, but as a cornered aristocrat clinging to a dead world. Overheard gossip in Rhodes about Beau's pacifism or Penelope's suffragette sympathies transforms them from side characters into tragic heirs trying to escape a legacy of blood. One forgotten document about Gray, dealings with the Lemoyne Raiders, can turn a routine mission into proof that the feud is bound up with wider reactionary violence. In the end, the complete story of the Braithwaites and the Grays is not handed down. It is excavated. It is assembled from dialogue and silence, from burned letters and broken gates, much like real history clawed out of archives and ruins. And beyond Lemoyne, other legends wait, just as fractured, ready to be reconstructed from what the gunfire leaves behind. Out of those ruins, a pattern emerges. The Braithwaites and the Grays form a story of rise, rot, and ruin. From slave-holding aristocrats to criminal dynasties, from grand halls and law offices to scorched earth and shattered families. What begins as genteel plantation rivalry ends as open warfare, leaving Rhodes quieter, poorer, and haunted by ghosts that never quite step into the light. From its humble beginnings in Lemoyne's plantation age, each house built its power on ownership of land, of labor, of law. The Braithwaites turned fields into fortunes through enslaved bodies, then into moonshine empires when the old economy collapsed. The Grays wrapped themselves in badges and tobacco tariffs, turning the sheriff's office into a family business. By the time Arthur arrives, both families are already hollowed out, clinging to titles and grudges while their heirs stumble through a world they no longer understand. In the truest sense, they are the living embodiment of the Old South's refusal to die. Catherine Braithwaite would rather burn her line than admit defeat. Tavish Gray would rather bleed Rhodes dry than share power with anyone not named Gray. Offered chances to adapt, to reconcile, to let Beau and Penelope's idealistic dreams pull them into a different future. They choose vengeance and denial. The old ways were dying, but these people would rather drag everyone into the grave than loosen their grip. Here the game's mirror tilts toward Dutch. Dutch, Catherine, and Tavish all cling to grand narratives about honor, family, and destiny, convinced the world is conspiring against them instead of simply moving past them. Dutch speaks of freedom and civilization, of loyalty and betrayal, while sacrificing his own family to fantasy. Catherine speaks of blood and legacy while selling children and burning her home. Tavish speaks of order and law while using the badge as a smuggler's shield. Different accents, same delusions. This is where the easy line between outlaw and gentleman collapses. Who is more civilized? The gang robbing trains in the night, or the sheriff orchestrating ambushes in broad daylight? Who is more criminal? Moonshiners in the bayou, or planters who turned entire generations into property? Red Dead Redemption 2 refuses to let civilization mean goodness, or outlaw mean simple evil. Brutality and hypocrisy are evenly distributed across camps and courthouses, across swamps and parlors. So what remains when the fires burn out and the gun smoke clears? A ruined manor, a weakened plantation, a traumatized town, a few surviving lovers trying to escape the script written for them? The true legacy of the Braithwaites and Grays is not their names or their land, but a warning. Any system built on exploitation will eventually ignite, and when it burns, it pulls in every lost soul standing too close. Dutch's camp, Lemoyne's aristocracy, the closing frontier itself, each is a fuse already lit, running towards the next explosion in this dying world. That fuse runs straight from the ashes of Braithwaite Manor and the bullet-scarred streets of Rhodes into the rest of the Van der Linde story. The feud is not a detour from the main plot. It is the hinge on which the entire saga swings. In Rhodes, every turning point arrives in quick, merciless succession. Sean's death on the street, framed by Sheriff Lee Gray's false hospitality, shatters the illusion that Dutch can charm his way through civilization. Jack's kidnapping at Braithwaite Manor exposes the cost of using a child as a symbol of freedom and family. Dutch's decision to play both sides, to gamble with lives in the name of a grand philosophy, forces the gang out of the relative safety of Clements Point and pushes them toward St. Denis, the true heart of the New World closing in. From its humble beginnings as just another score in a sleepy southern town, Rhodes becomes a story of escalation, of dreams and delusions colliding with entrenched power. The ambush at the bank steps, the burning plantation, the sight of Catherine Braithwaite stumbling into the fire with Dutch's name on her lips. These moments teach lessons the gang never fully learns. Trust is revealed as transactional, power as theatrical, and every alliance as a temporary mask worn over betrayal. Those lessons echo far beyond Lemoyne. On Guarma, Dutch repeats Rhodes on an island scale, inserting himself into a local conflict he barely understands, promising liberation while chasing his own legend. In St. Denis, the same arrogance that led him to toy with the Braithwaites and Grays drives the disastrous bank heist, where Hosea and Lenny die under the cold gaze of modern finance and organized law. By Beaver Hollow, Dutch's schemes resemble a plantation war with no plantation left, only a shrinking patch of mud and a leader who has become the living embodiment of the very tyranny he once condemned. Rhodes also ties eras together. The ruined manor and the weakened Caliga Hall linger into Red Dead Redemption, their decayed grandeur standing beside the Marston Ranch as monuments to different versions of the American dream. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but the scars of Lemoyne's aristocracy still shape the lawmen, landowners, and outlaws who survive into John's time. What is Ross's cold bureaucracy if not the polished successor to Lee Gray's parochial corruption? Seen from above, the feud is one thread in a vast tapestry. The O'Driscoll conflict, Blackwater, Rhodes, Guarma, St. Denis, Beaver Hollow, and finally Beecher's Hope. pull on anyone, and the whole pattern of loyalty and betrayal, of freedom and civilization, begins to reveal itself. The final step is to stand back and ask, what does this tapestry mean? In the next closing passage, the flames of Braithwaite Manor, the smoke of St. Denis, and the quiet fields of John's Ranch will be brought together to see what this entire saga of families, feuds, and fires really says about the West, and about those who tried, in the truest sense, to outrun a world that had already decided their fate. So the tapestry pulls back to where it began, Lemoyne in the half-light. The mist still clings to the bayou. The streets of Rhodes still wake slow, that single main road stretching past the depot, past the sheriff's office that once answered to a Gray, out toward the fields where tobacco and blood were raised together. And on the horizon, the two great houses still mark the land, one a blackened skeleton, the other a sagging relic of its former pride. Braithwaite Manor, from its humble beginnings as a monument to slaveholding wealth, now stands only as scorched brick and twisted iron, a wound in the middle of Scarlet Meadows. Caliga Hall survives, but only barely. Its columns are cracked, its paint flaking, its fields a little emptier each year. Side by side, ruin and decay form a single sentence about what that version of civilization really was. In the truest sense, both houses are graves, because the Braithwaites and the Grays did not fight to preserve freedom as most would understand it. They fought to preserve their freedom to own, to exploit, to command. Their philosophy of liberty was simple: power without question, hierarchy without mercy, a world where land and law existed to keep certain names on top. Catherine Braithwaite's cold fury, Lee Gray's smug authority, the hired guns and whipped servants, all of it, was the living embodiment of a dream that demanded someone else's chains. Dutch looked at that world and spat on it, yet his own dream of outlaw liberty twisted into the same shape. He spoke of throwing off civilization, of resisting a rigged system, of riding beyond the reach of railroads and banks. But each time he chose guns over people, gold over family, pride over honesty, his freedom narrowed into something just as cruel: the freedom to sacrifice others to keep his own myth alive. How different is a plantation baron from an outlaw prophet when both treat human lives as tools? Rhodes becomes the answer to that question. A town run by a sheriff who is also a smuggler. A countryside ruled by families who talk of honor while poisoning each other's wells. A passing gang that claims to be above it all, then burns everything down. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom reduced to the barrel of a gun. When liberty is only domination, through law, through land, through violence, tragedy is not an accident. It is the destination. Yet in the cracks of this collapsing order, something else flickers. Beau Gray and Penelope Braithwaite are almost absurd in such a place. Two nervous, idealistic souls reading suffragette pamphlets, clutching each other's hands while their families trade bullets. Their refusal to inherit the feud, their decision to leave it all behind on that rattling train, hints at a different kind of future. Arthur, riding with them, begins to feel it too. His growing shame, his letters to Mary, his quiet help for strangers on the road. Each small act is a step away from the old ways that were dying. John carries that thread further. From the very beginning, his story is about leaving the gang's corrosive freedom for a smaller, harder, more honest life. A ranch, a fence, a family. Not the wild liberty Dutch promised, but responsibility, empathy, and the willingness to say no to inherited hate. In a world that worships power, choosing to walk away from it is the most radical act. So the camera settles, at last, on Scarlet Meadows. The gunfire has faded. The feud has burned itself out. Wind moves through the trees, bending the tall grass where riders once charged. From the blackened bones of Braithwaite Manor, a last thin thread of smoke rises, then unravels into the sky. It drifts over the bayou, over the tired roofs of Rhodes, as if the land itself is finally exhaling, after generations of holding its breath, making room for a different story, if anyone is brave enough to live it. The smoke fades, but the questions remain. When the last embers die at Braithwaite Manor and Caliga Hall falls silent, the land is left with more than ruined brick and trampled fields. It is left with the problem of blame. In a story of family pride and outlaw ambition, of freedom twisted into cruelty and civilization rotted from within, who truly destroyed Rhodes and Scarlet Meadows? From the very beginning, the feud between Catherine Braithwaite's dynasty and Lee Gray's crumbling aristocracy was the living embodiment of a dying order. Both families built their world on enslaved labor, on moonshine and tobacco smuggling, on law worn as a costume rather than a duty. Catherine ruled Braithwaite Manor through terror and secrets. Lee turned the sheriff's star into a family crest, using his badge to shield Gray interests. Long before Dutch rode in, the old ways were dying, and these houses were already rotting from the inside. Yet Dutch and the van der Linde gang did not pass through as innocent witnesses. They walked into a powder keg and struck every match they could find. Dutch sent Arthur and the others to work both sides, to play loyal farmhands and hired guns for two rival empires, then quietly sabotage each in turn. Jobs that began as petty harassment turned into open ambushes, stolen shipments, and public humiliation. Was Dutch merely exploiting a doomed system? Or did his philosophy of freedom through chaos pour fuel on a fire that might otherwise have burned out more slowly? Then comes complicity, not just the proud matriarch and the corrupt sheriff, not just the outlaw leader dreaming of one last score, but the entire town orbiting their power. The shopkeepers who took Gray money and looked away. The respectable citizens who whispered about Braithwaite cruelty and still attended their gatherings. The laborers and tenant farmers who had little choice but to obey, yet still loaded wagons, guarded doors, and carried messages that kept the feud alive. How much guilt belongs to those who felt trapped, but helped the machine turn all the same? Inside the gang, the same question lingers. Arthur, John, Bill, Javier, even Hosea before his doubts hardened, they all rode into Rhodes, took the pay, laughed at the absurdity of two decaying dynasties hiring outlaws to ruin each other. Two men trying to rob each other, and both handing over the gun. At what point does following Dutch's orders, despite misgivings, become betrayal in the truest sense, not just of his ideals, but of the innocent lives caught in the crossfire, from Sean's death on the street to Jack's abduction into the bayou shadows? So where does the greatest blame rest? With Catherine and Lee clinging to a dead world, with Dutch turning their hatred into spectacle, or with a society that let it all happen, so long as the trains ran and the fields stayed green? Different answers reveal different values, justice or mercy, intent or consequence, bloodline or choice. Because this is not just a story of Lemoyne, it is a pattern repeated across this world, from its humble beginnings on frontier trails to the polished halls of St. Denis. Future tales may follow other regions and factions, other lost soul dynasties and outlaw families, but which stories rise next will be shaped by how this tragedy is judged, and by which turning points matter most in that judgment. From that judgment, a path opens. This has been a story of two dynasties devouring each other in the name of honor, profit, and a dead civilization, traced from the very beginning of their rise to the ashes of their fall. Anyone who has stayed through every betrayal in Rhodes, every ride through Scarlet Meadows, has ridden the full length of that road and seen how completely a family philosophy can rot from within. This journey has not been a quick retelling of missions, but a long ride through context, subtext, and consequence, following how an idealistic image of Southern gentility crumbled into moonshine, tobacco, and quiet terror. For those who want more tales told in this way, more cinematic, narrative-driven deep dives into the forgotten corners of Red Dead Redemption 2, there is another trail already waiting on the horizon. The world was changing in Lemoyne, but it was changing just as violently in the forests, swamps, and cities beyond. Because the Braithwaites and Grays are only one chapter in a much larger ledger of outlaw families, lost soul factions, and hidden communities. The next complete lore ride could plunge into the Murfree brood, picking apart how a band of feral raiders became the living embodiment of everything civilization fears in the dark. Or it could follow the O'Driscolls from their humble beginnings as Dutch's mirror image into a cautionary echo of what the van der Linde gang might have become even sooner. Another path leads deeper into the mist. A full breakdown of the night folk would turn every lantern-lit crossing in Bluewater Marsh into a story of whispered disappearances, superstition, and frontier cruelty buried under swamp water. Or the focus could shift to the polished, poisonous heart of St. Denis, tracing the politics, corruption, and quiet class war that shaped that city's salons, factories, and back alleys. Which story should rise next? Which faction, family, or town deserves to have every thread pulled and every secret named? Those who know others who cherish this world's detail can carry this tale further, sharing it with friends who have ridden past these fields 100 times without seeing the full design beneath the missions. Long-form lore turns familiar robberies and shootouts into something else. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom promised and freedom denied. It casts old scenes in new light and makes even a simple ride feel heavier. So the camera pulls back from Rhodes. The burned ribs of Braithwaite Manor stand against the sky, Caliga Hall sits half empty and haunted, and the town's main street lies quiet under the weight of everything that happened there. Ride past those ruins, past that polite little square, and remember, every landmark in this world, from the grandest city to the loneliest cabin, has a complete story waiting to be told in full. The next one begins when the next trail is chosen.